Welcome to Headlines. This is Ari Wasserman sitting in for David Lichtenstein. Today we are going to delve into a very sensitive topic. Should a student ever be expelled from school, and if so, under what circumstances? We are going to discuss how a school should deal with a child who is not adhering to school policy. How severe does an infraction need to be to warrant expulsion? How many other students need to be negatively impacted by the student? What if we have a student who is doing drugs, or he or she is not just doing drugs but dealing in drugs, or has a smartphone against school policy, or has unfiltered internet access at home? Just want to say from the beginning, from the outset, to expel is a last resort because the consequences can be so dire to the student, to the family of the student. It could cause scars and worse for life. I personally know a number of people who have been expelled from school. Some of them were expelled from one school, some from two schools, some from numerous schools. And it is true that certain people are able to bounce back from what they perceive as absolute rejection and go on to lead productive and sometimes unbelievably successful lives, influencing Klal Yisrael, having a positive influence on Klal Yisrael. But for the most part, when we expel a student, the blow is severe and lasting to their self-esteem. They feel absolutely rejected by the community, and accordingly, their Yiddishkeit suffers tremendously. So it is my hope, it is my sincere hope that this episode of Headlines will go on to help everyone involved with troublesome students, be it teachers, principals, school advisors, parents who have students in the same class, that we can know how to deal with the issues. Understand that when we have a troublesome student, it's not that that student wants to misbehave, but there is something underlying in that student that is causing the misbehavior. And if we can delve into that and understand what's going on behind that misbehavior, hopefully we can save that student in ways short of expulsion. Yet, nonetheless, I do want to say that if expulsion is deemed necessary by the administration, by the principal, there are sensitive ways to do that, and there are also traumatic ways to expel a student. And it is critical. It is absolutely necessary to be as sensitive as possible given a difficult situation, that the expulsion not be overly detrimental to the student. I do just want to tell a story about the Chazon Ish that really brings out this point. So it was known and is known that the standard of the Chazon Ish in expelling a student from school is not enough that the student be a chote. It's not enough that the student be violating school policy, violating halacha, but the student has to be both a chote and a machti. That student has to not only be doing bad himself, but also negatively influencing others as well. That is a chote umachti. And there was a time that an administration made the decision that a student had to go. They needed to expel the student, and they came to the Chazon Ish to get his eitzah. And the Chazon Ish said, I have a condition for this student being expelled. I do agree. Given the facts and circumstances, the student is a chote umachti, but we have to make it as sensitive a process as possible so it's not traumatic to the student. And he called in the Gaon Shmuel Kowalski before he was a Gaon, before he was a Rav. He was still a Bacher at the time, and he tells him as follows: Shmuel Tzvi, there is a student that's going to be expelled. We're going to delay the expulsion, and I want you to start learning with this student. I need you to establish a relationship with this student. The point was to establish a safety net for the student. So the Chazon Ish required that he had this chavrusha, this high caliber, high quality boy that would be learning with him. Shmuel Tzvi Kowalski would be learning with him, not only before the expulsion would then happen, but the chavrusa had to continue to ensure that this student would have a safety net before and even after the expulsion, given that this is a very traumatic experience for anyone. So we learned two very critical points from the story of the Chazon Ish. The standard of the Chazon Ish when somebody can be expelled is a chote umachti. It's not enough to be a chote. And number two, when it is done and it is deemed necessary to expel that student, it has to be done in the most sensitive way possible. Before introducing our distinguished list of guests, I'm just going to do quickly the riddle of the week. So the riddle of the week is from Parshas Tetzaveh, and the question goes as follows. There is a pasuk that has a remez to how long the first two Batei Mikdash will stand. So how many years did they stand? There's a remez in a pasuk. And in addition, not only that, the same pasuk has a remez as well that the Bayis Shlishi, the third Beis HaMikdash, Yibane B'meira B'yameinu, will be eternal. So we're looking for a pasuk. I'll even be more specific. It's Perek Chaf Zayin in our Parshas Tetzaveh, Perek Chaf Zayin, Shmos Chaf Zayin. Where is there a pasuk that has a remez to both that the first two Beis HaMikdash, Batei Mikdash, that they stood for a certain amount of time, and the Bayis Shlishi will be eternal? Appearing on our show today in the following order, we will start off with Rabbi Avrohom Neuberger, who is the Rav of Congregation Shaarei Tefillah. He is also a member of Yated Chinuch Roundtable. He has a lot of experience in Chinuch in general and also dealing with troublesome students and expulsion from school. We are then going to go and speak with Joel. It happened to him 7 times. Joel was expelled 7 times from various yeshivas, and we are going to learn some important lessons from his experiences. Thereafter, we are going to speak with Rabbi Yisroel Grossberg, who ran a girls' high school for many years. Girls who were, for the most part, expelled from elsewhere, had nowhere else to go, and he's going to discuss with us his experiences in expulsion and how bad it can be for somebody being thrown out of school. Thereafter, we're going to speak with Rabbi Shmuel Yaakov Klein of Torah U'Mesorah, who has a lot of experience as a machanech, as an administrator, and also at Torah U'Mesorah. Thereafter, we're going to speak with Shalva Schneider, who is the director of a program in Yerushalayim called JewEssence. That is for girls post-high school, for the most part, girls who have no other options. They've been expelled from numerous schools, and then they come to JewEssence and they receive the chizuk necessary, hopefully, to get them back on their feet. And we are going to end off the show with a very powerful story from Jonathan Rosenblum, the famed author and writer for Mishpacha Magazine, about the severity and the importance attached of thinking hard before expelling a student. Joining us now is Rabbi Avrohom Neuberger, who is the Rav of Congregation Shaarei Tefillah of New Hempstead and the author of Positive Vision. He's also a well-known speaker, author, and expert in Chinuch, and he's on the Chinuch Roundtable of the Yated. Rabbi Neuberger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Rabbi Neuberger, I'll ask the most basic question. If there's a troublesome student in school, he could damage everyone in the class, friends, but on the other hand, by expelling him, we could do terrible damage to the child. To the student's self-esteem could be shot. His frumkeit could go out the window, destroy shidduchim, and I'm not talking only about boys, girls as well. So how do we balance those two, the needs of the yachid, and not destroying the yachid here versus saving the tzibur?
Right. It's the most tricky questions that a mechanech and a menal has to deal with. The thing is, it's not even always dealing a question of a yachid against the tzibur the way you're framing it. Right from our very beginning of our history, if you talk about Avraham Avinu and Yishmael and Yitzchak, right? So Sarah says that she wants to get rid of Yishmael, and Avraham Avinu is not very happy about that. And Vayomer Elokim al Avraham al Yereh beinecha al anav al amasecha kol asher toimer lecha Sarah shema b'kayla, right? Kiv yitzchak lecha Sarah. So here is a situation where Sarah feels clearly that Ishmael will be a bad influence on her son, on Yitzchak, and she decides to send him away with the knowledge. She was a Neviah, Yiska, right, bigger in Neviahs than her husband, that this might turn bad, which Taka did. But nevertheless, because of the influence that he might have on Yitzchak, she apparently felt that it was Kedai to send her Yishmael away, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was masking with her, despite Avram's misgivings. So it seems it's not a question always of a yachid against the rabbim. It's rather the focal point is there a mahdi? is there a chayte umachti? When there's a machti aspect over here, then it's justified to send somebody away. Obviously, this is a huge question that has to be dealt with much yeshiva das. But that much we do see that, Mamash at the very start, the first generation of Jews, they dealt with this issue.
So, Rabbi Neuberger, what you're saying is even if it's not a troublesome yachid versus a tzibur, but a troublesome yachid versus another yachid, as long as that troublesome individual is a mahdi, we have to deal with the situation, and it may be a basis for exploring an expulsion.
Right. That's what it seems like from that story. The fascinating thing is that the backdrop is that earlier when Yishmael, and I guess also very much plays into this whole situation, is that Yishmael right away wasn't behaving properly, right? And that's the question. What happened when Yishmael was sent away with Hagar from Avraham Avinu, right? So the Ramban says that there was a hate. That Avraham and Sarah sent away Hagar, right? And Akash Baruch Hu told him to go back. But at that point, like what was Sarah's thinking? Like when you read the story, it sounds pretty disturbing. That she wasn't treating Sarah properly, so therefore Sarah sends her away. It sounds a little bit strange. Except I've heard, by David Foreman, he says a very nice idea. He said the whole reason why Sarah gave Hagar in the first place as a wife for Avraham was because she said, listen, I don't have any children. I'll raise the stepson, Ki'ilu, as the descendant of Avraham Avinu. But that was predicated on the fact that she'll have ashpa on the Yitzchak, on Yishmael. And when that wasn't working out, so therefore Sarah said, if she's not going to allow herself to be subservient to me, Hagar, I won't be able to have hashpa on Yishmael. And therefore, she felt that it was proper to send her away, because then the whole plan didn't work. You see, it's a very subtle thing when it comes to these chinuch questions. Once the structure of chinuch breaks down, so then the powers of hashpa, can be corrupted. Over there, actually, the Ramban said they made a mistake, that they shouldn't have sent her away at that point. It could have worked out. But later on, apparently, Yishmael already had reached the Madrega and he was a Masis, so it was proper to send her away. So it's not a question so much of, right, like I was saying, Yachad against the Rabbim. It's more of a question of a Masis. This seems to be the larger issue.
Right, but there is a difference between a masis, which is somebody who really pushes others to do averos, as opposed to a mahdi. Maybe is a little bit more passive, just being there, and can have a negative influence on others. But a masis, at least Moshe has shuvas on this. So when it comes to a principal, a menahel, making a decision, has a troublesome child, what are some of the yisurim that can be implicated here? For example, lo samar damrecha, both for the individual and the others, or is there a lifnei iver component here we have to consider? Because I assume somebody who's sent away is going to more easily go off the derech. So what are the things that have to be considered here?
Yeah, that's for sure. A very strong consideration. Just practically speaking to Manalim, it's almost never that a Manal will say that I'm willing to send away a child, and just that's it. He's off to the woods. They almost always try to find another option. It's very rarely really a question of just throwing him out and without any option. So we always have to qualify the question in those terms. To what degree are they exposing the child to lifnei iver is going to go off the derech? It's not necessarily the case. Very often it's just a question of finding a better option. That said, of course, the very act of being cast from a yeshiva is so disturbing to a child that even if they could find another moiseh that would be more appropriate for the child, the act of being, the violence sort of being thrown out of yeshiva can rend terrible psychological harm. So if it's done properly and it's done with an act of chesed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the child is going to that will reach the madrega of lifnei iver. The Chofetz Chaim talks about in Mabak Lashon Hara and Klal Tes that you really only over lifnei iver, like if you hit a kid and he's going to hit you back, the Gemara in Kedushin. That's only true when it's very close. It's very shchiach that's going to happen. If it's not very shchiach, then it's not a question of lifnei iver. And over here, hopefully, whenever they do have to throw a child out of yeshiva, they're certainly not going to make it in a situation when it's going to reach that madrega. This everybody says that it's a question of din nefashos. It really is, because if you don't do it in the right way, and obviously the getter has to be a question of a machti, somebody who's affecting the class negatively. If the kid himself is not learning, there's never a reason to throw a child out. It shouldn't be really on the radar. It shouldn't be like on the options to do with a child is going to give him homework and also get cast out of yeshiva. It's like it has to be so out of the pale that it's barely it's the last resort and a great extreme. But in cases when it has to be done, it has to be done with such a chain and such another option that the violence of being thrown out of yeshiva has to be very minimized. Hopefully, when it's done in that way, then we're not dealing with the question of lifnei iver, because then it's not borrow that the kid's going to go off. That's
right. So I'm hearing two important points. How it's done is critical, and finding that student a place to go to, even if it's done in a proper way. But if he doesn't have somewhere to go to, that is not going to be an effective means of saving that child.
And I've seen, just again from experience, that it makes such a big difference. Some yeshivas play lip service to that another option. Well, you could always go to A, B, or C, and that's it. And then so they officially didn't throw you out, but they gave you another option. So what do you want from us? When it's done that way, then it's just as violent, or just as horrible for the child as being just thrown to the woods.
Right.
Then it can be terrible. But sometimes it's not done that way. Sometimes it's done. They explain to the child that this is not the place for you, and the other yeshiva you need more space. Other yeshiva is your type of nusach, and you'll be more comfortable there. When it's done with that type of of sympathy, then it's much better off. And I spoke to just someone now recently who told me that he very rarely, but he did have to throw a child out, but he constantly remained in touch with the child. And even when he was in the other yeshiva, he called him and he was connected with him, and he said how he was doing. So the kid walked away with a feeling that is taka for his benefit. This is just the wrong place for him. So it can be done. It's obviously, but with tremendous delicacy, it can be done. But it has to be done really with the feeling of it's not about the yeshiva. That's the worst thing. If it's about the yeshiva, then it could be catastrophic. Yeah.
Right. It's about the child. Now let's take a step back. Things are going awry in the class, and your son comes home, or your daughter comes home, and you can tell something is wrong. And you say, "What's wrong?" You say, "There's a child that's really acting out, doing things, but I'm concerned. Is there a lashon hara about telling you?" So, what do we say in that situation when there's something troubling going on in the class? Can kids come home and speak freely with us, or are there limitations when it comes to lashon hara?
No, there's no limitations when it comes to lashon hara. This is the ultimate with TLS, and a child should certainly feel comfortable speaking to the parents. And if a kid has that type of communication with the parents, there's no lashon hara. However, but the biggest thing is that the worst thing in the world is to be a snitch. If you want to be guaranteed that you'll be an outcast in the class or in the school, if the word gets out that you're a snitch, you're finished. So now that the parent has the information, he has to take unbelievable precautions when sharing that information, that it shouldn't be traceable to his kid, because it could be very, very damaging for the kid. So at the same time, it's critical that the kid should share the information with the parents, but it can't get back to the kid. That would be a terrible effect. Yeah.
So the parents now have that information, and they can decide whether to call the teacher, to call the principal.
Right.
What's that decision like? When do we call? When do we not call? And if we do call, how do we tell them?
Again, it's so much totally in whether the principals are somebody you could trust. When you have the right people in charge, so then you could trust them to do the right thing with the information. But not everybody is, you have to, and in every yeshiva there are some principals that are good, and not necessarily all of them are, so then you have to speak to the right guy with the right feeling, and it's a tricky thing, because generally, like, let's say somebody who's really in charge of the Moisid will have a hard time separating the Moisid's interest with the child's interest. The one who gives his life and blood towards the school sometimes will have a hard time, not always, many times not, but he has a negias because it's his school, he raises the money, whatever it might be. So then that negias at times can interfere with the judgment. Sometimes you're better off going to an assistant principal or a Sheol Meshiv in a base medrash, not the man in charge, because their lack of self-interest allows them to see things more objectively and have a better take on how to proceed. I just want to say one thing, a very large issue, and that is very often when a child, let's say worst case scenario, the kid did something that is mimach the other children, and we don't feel they could turn him around, and it's time to send him out. One important factor to weigh, and this is really a very important factor, is that your whole objective is for the sake of the remaining children. That's the only justification, really. Your only justification is the fact that he's being mach the other children. But if the kids that are remaining feel betrayed by the school because one of theirs was thrown out, then you can almost lose as much as you gain. The fact, the kids have to feel that the yeshiva is in it for the kids. If they come away with the feeling that the kid was sent away not because of them or not because of the kid, but because of the school's reputation or some other thing like that, it causes terrible damage, almost as much as you gain by protecting the kids from whatever specific thing that kid was exposing them to. You're losing them in the innocence that the children are losing now. The trust in the trust in the school, the trust in the Rebbeim, the trust in Manal. It's like a very, very important thing that there has to be tremendous damage control when you send a kid out. That the kids have to be explained why it happened. Like what did the kid do? Like, there has to be a way of conveying it to the children. I don't know if it has to be a meeting or something, or it could be maybe informal, maybe that's the way, but the kids have to go away with the feeling that it was only done with a good kite and what was necessary out of concern for the child, a concern for them, but it wasn't for the kids, for the school's own sake, because if that's not conveyed to them, the upshot of the feeling of betrayal that they have towards the school is terrible.
So it has to be really turned a very negative thing into somewhat of a positive thing for the other children.
Right, they have to understand it. There has to be open communication as to what happened. Whether it doesn't have to be sometimes explicit, sometimes it could be implicit, but there has to be a means of conveying to the kids that there was all ben Sinai Atayv, and everybody's trying to do what's best for Hashem and for the kids and so forth. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I have a list of potential considerations and wanted to get your read on if these are possibilities to consider expulsion from a school. So what if the child himself is not the issue, but it's his parent, or there's non-payment of tuition and the parents and the family are going away for Pesach programs and going to summer camps and driving fancy cars, but the tuition is not being paid and there's no other way to pressure the parents other than threatening and possibly expelling that child to get the tuition payment. Are those a basis for expulsion?
No, so you see, there's a huge difference between expulsion and not taking in the first place, or waiting until the end of the year. There's a very big difference between the two. Once a kid is in your school, and once it's during the school year itself, then there's no way that anything like that would qualify for a basis of expulsion. Like, the Gemara says you're not supposed to teach a kid she'ein hagan, right? Why? Because if you teach a kid she'ein hagan, then it's like you're throwing Evan out of Makulis. It's like almost all sorts of things like that. And one of the things that the Gemara says is that you might have to go to Golas, because if he kills, right, then Megal and Rabbi Imoy, so therefore don't teach the kids She'ein Hagen. But that tells you that why can't I just drop the child at that point? He's a kid She'ein Hagen. If he's going to Golas, I want to drop him. It doesn't work that way. Once he's your student, then you're committed. So it's one thing about not taking in a student She'ein Hagen whose families are not from and so forth, all sorts of problems like that. But once you're committed to the family, then it's a whole different thing. Then it's your own kid. Then your level of commitment before you throw a kid out is much more extreme. So let's say your case is over here. To throw out a kid in school in the middle of the year because the parents aren't paying tuition, that's completely not possible. Can you not allow him into the at the beginning of the next year? Maybe. That could be an option, maybe. There has to be. This has to be done with a lot of chakiras and bedikas. That's a whole issue that has to be addressed. That all these type of questions, let's say, throwing a kid out of school. Who's the arbiter on that? Who's deciding that? So in Shom Yeshivas they have a rabbinic committee. So the manal and the teacher or the rebbe, whoever knows the situation, can present the case in front of the rabbinic committee, and they could decide. But I don't think it should be a unilateral decision. There has to be some sort of way of making sure that it's not being done just like willy-nilly. Even it should not be done willy-nilly, but there has to be some sort of oversight. And anyways, so getting back to your questions, the first one was about tuition. Maybe at the beginning of the year, maybe it is. I would say that has to be taken with the rabbinic committee. I think that's okay. What was the other question?
If a parent is a problem, let's say the parent was thrown into jail, or he's a drug dealer, or he went off the derech.
No, that's nothing. The parents, that's for sure not a reason to, in and of itself, to expel a child or even not let him back in school. That's not consideration. What is a consideration is if you feel that because of that, this child is going to have a bad effect on other children, then we have to open up the case. But that in itself, the fact that the parents are no good, that's no connection whatsoever to the child. To the child, not at all. No. Yeah.
Okay, so what if we have a child, and we'll assume that they were accepted to school already and has a different hashkafa from the rest of the students in the school, or wears the wrong yarmulke or something like that? Would that be a basis to
Absolutely
expel?
not. He's not a machdi. He's nothing. No, he's not a machdi. Absolutely not. Yeah.
Now, if we have a girl that dresses inappropriately after school, they've warned her, they've seen her, and she continues out of school to dress inappropriately, would that be a basis?
I would think it's a basis to find her another school at the end of the year. During the year, no, not during the school years. At the end of the year, to find her another school. By the way, I just want to point one thing out. That's from experience. There are certain grades that if you ask a child to find another school, you're basically casting him to the street. Very often, if a high school will ask a kid to leave after 10th or 11th grade, it's such a red flag to all other mesiftas, the other mesiftas just won't take him in. So, because, why couldn't you make it through the whole high school? And it's such a red flag that a lot of high schools won't take them in. So, even at the end of the year to say that, it's not at the end of 11th grade, they can't come back for 12th grade, that's basically throwing them out of the system altogether. So that's a very chamadik. It's not the same thing as any other grade, really.
That's a really important point. Same at the end of, for going into 7th grade or going into 8th grade should be the same thing if there's a change.
Right. There are certain grades, right. There are certain grades that when a school sees they're being thrown by that grade, it's such a red flag that you couldn't make it through the system for one more year, then you're basically casting the kid to that. After 7th grade, which school is going to take in for 8th grade? Nobody. Basically, you're throwing the kid out in the middle of the year. There's no difference. And it has to be dealt with with the same chumrah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, how about if we have a boy or a girl coming into school and talking about inappropriate movies that he or she is watching, and getting other students interested in those type of movies?
That depends on the school, I think.
So it depends on what the policy is in the school and what the norm would be in the school.
Policy is not the point. See, that policy is not the issue so much. What's policy have to do with it? Policy is relevant to what the type of kids you're going to take in the first place. When you're making a decision about what type of kids you're catering to, right? Then that's a policy question. But in the middle of the year, do you feel that what the kid is doing, what he's talking about, and so forth, is going to influence the other children to do Averis? It has to be something like that. It can't just be a policy question about what the school's going to tolerate. At the end of the year, you could talk about that, about when it comes to taking children in. But at this point, it has to be really a question of serious, something very serious, not just
not just a school policy.
I
think probably the biggest question in breaking the school policy is the school policy is you can't have a smartphone. And we have an example of a child who has a smartphone, 9th grade, 10th grade, or parents who have smartphones, or the family has internet at home. So talk with us about those. During the middle of the year, at the end of the year, is it filtered, is it not filtered? What are the options? Because this happens all the time.
See, and over there, it is a real question because, the kids could really get exposed to the worst possibly. If you have a smartphone without any filter or anything, then and at the right age, at the wrong age, then it could really corrupt children. So I could see a school having a very again, it has to be done with warnings and so forth. I wouldn't throw a kid out right away. But that is a machti. That's somebody who really can have a very detrimental effect on other children, and the school, obviously with the proper upfront information and so forth, they can make a rule about that, about unfiltered the smartphones and so forth. That I think is valid.
Okay, and would the school have to say you broke your policy, you're out, or would they have to see if the person is being a machti?
Oh no, there's no way. It's real din in the fashions. You have to go through it. You have to with warnings and over again, and bring the parents in and bring the Rav in, and it's like nothing can be done one strike and you're out. Something about throwing a kid out of middle school is really the end of the fashions. You're very much casting him, to a possibility of going who knows where. So it can't be done at all. And just broke the wall, you're out. It doesn't work that way, not at all.
Right.
Again, you can talk about the next year, but you can't not in the middle of the year. Chas v'shalom.
I guess that would be similar for somebody who regularly dresses out of the dress code, especially in the girls' schools that they have.
Yeah.
Some has very strict requirements about earrings and the this and the that and the makeup.
Right.
So a girl who regularly comes out of what we would call the dress code.
Right. Again, so again, we could talk about suspensions and we could talk about other, more temporary type of punishments, but and expelling, it's a very extreme action that would have to go through a lot of steps, a lot of hurdles before you get to that situation.
Right. Now, when I was preparing for this topic, somebody mentioned to me somebody who is apparently fairly famous. I had never heard of the person, but apparently almost everyone else has. And he was thrown out of 3 yeshivas. His name is David Draymond from a band Disturbed. And I was personally fairly disturbed when I saw the reasons he was thrown out of the yeshiva. Not that he shouldn't have been thrown out, but they were incredibly valid reasons for being thrown out of yeshiva. One of them was that he got upset at the principal of his school and he torched his van. He also threw out a student out of the 2nd floor window. And the student got injured, obviously. So obviously we have reasons that sometimes we have to put our feet down and expel the kids. So if we have somebody selling drugs in school, if they're getting others to drink, to smoke, etc., what would be the approach in dealing with such a student?
Yeah, that's another thing. I should have said that. Besides for being machti or mesis, machti is a better word, like you said, any action that's harmful, either to himself or to other people, is also means for almost immediate expulsion, right? Because you can't allow people to be harmed. You come to school and the children can't be subject to any harm. So that would be that would be a means certainly. Physical harm, for sure. The same thing is true. For certain types of drugs. I'm not sure. Like in today's, you would have in today's milieu about marijuana. I don't know. Marijuana use. Does a kid that get thrown out? It's not. I would think most high schools would not throw out nowadays. Maybe yes. It's not that clear.
Right.
Because marijuana has become more popular. But that's the fact, So, but let's say a more dangerous thing for sure, like cocaine or something like that, where it's much a danger, then I would think that would be grounds for expelling right away.
Right. Ideally, it would still be done in a kind way, and it would be ideal if the principal would stay in touch with that student, because maybe down the line it would have a positive influence on that individual.
Right.
But indeed, if he's a Mahdi, and even if it could even be a Macy's with these issues, we need to deal with the issue quickly.
Yeah. There is certain yeshivas, like yeshivas that sort of, I don't know how I want to say this nicely, like the bottom rung sort of yeshivas. Yeshivas that deal with the real problem cases, that's the ones where every other Masifta won't take him and they'll take him in. They can have like a different admissions policy than other places. Whereas other yeshivas, like once he's in, then you're stuck with him, and then you really have to, make sure that he makes it to the end of the year, unless it's really din the fascist. I think yeshiva like that can upfront make tanoim, make conditions that if you fail one drug test, then you're out. The yeshiva like that, which is dealing with really hardcore cases, I think their acceptance policy can be upfront conditional. That if you don't tell certain things, these 3 rules, then you're out.
Right. That's what is necessary in order to manage the students.
Right. Otherwise, the whole school becomes unmanageable. Exactly. Right.
Right, interesting. Now, let's get back to the student who has been expelled. So he's going and he's interviewing at other schools. Mm-hmm. And they're probably curious, why are you changing schools? If they ask him, why are you moving schools, is he permitted to lie or to fudge the answer a little bit and say, things didn't work out? Or does he have to answer and say, I was expelled from the school and that's why I'm coming to you?
Well, yes, and the child himself or the school?
The child or the parents of the child. Oh, and that's good. And the school also, when they call the school and say, why is he coming to us?
Yeah, that's the main question. The parents themselves, I think it's almost, they could soft sell it. They could say, it didn't work out. I don't know how much they have to expose. Like, they can't lie, but they don't have to, expose the whole truth. The much bigger question is, what is any responsible school will call the previous school? And what does the previous school have to say? And I think that school has to be completely upfront. I was a Beis Medrash Rebbe myself in the Beis Medrash for a while, and we had a particular case where as soon as the kid applied, I thought that the kid would be a bad influence. He was very charismatic and bright, but he had an edge to him that I thought would be very problematic. And I called the previous yeshiva, and his Rebbe, gave me a whole story that
run around the bush.
Run around the bush and they took him in, and it was a disaster. It was such a chayte Mahdi that he ruined the whole chair. So the previous school has to be completely upfront about what's going on. I have a relative that was also a Rebbe in a certain yeshiva, and it was a boy that was also that came from another place, and also with recommendations, this and that, and also he says not only did he ruin that class, he ruined the whole flavor of the yeshiva. was downgraded because this charismatic, very bright boy was a real rebel, and he affected the whole yeshiva negatively. So it's a tremendous achrayus for the other yeshivas to be up front. I think to ask the parents, I think that's a lot to ask. You can't tell them they don't have to lie, but to ask the parents to fess up the whole story, that's a lot to ask of. But any yeshiva worth their salt will be in touch with the previous ma'aseh to see what happened, and the previous ma'aseh is mechuyev. This is real to say what the story is, and then the new yeshiva could make a educated decision whether they want to take him in or not.
Right. I have one more question, not exactly on point, but related. I understand that conversation in the teacher's room between teachers is often gossiping or discussing the children, the students, and the various challenges. So what's the getter of what's permitted and not what's permitted? Maybe the getter is gossip as opposed to toelis, but what would be permitted in that construct?
In the teacher's room, nothing is permitted. There's never a reason for public consumption of anything. That's stam lashon hara. In the teacher's room, there's no reason to share anything. In fact, the for Rebbe of, let's say, 6th grade to share his impressions of a child that's going into 7th grade, so like you want to give the 7th grade Rebbe a heads up, generally speaking, I would say that's also not fair, because the kid has a right to start with a fresh page, and that's also the wrong thing to do. And I don't think it's lashon hara l'te'elis, because very often it's not l'te'elis, because the kid has a right to start with on a new page. It's only in the extreme cases when you feel like, when you, the 6th grade Rebbe, feels that his child needs special care and watch out, and under rare circumstances, extreme circumstances, then the 6th grade Rebbe can give the heads up for the next year's Rebbe. He must probably even run it by the banal first to make sure his judgment is proper. But otherwise, I feel that the impressions of one year's Rebbe should not be given to the next year's Rebbe. It's completely unfair.
Very interesting.
Okay, can I just say one more thing?
Please.
Yeah, when very often. This is like maybe expanding the topic a little bit. There is too much stress, I think, on exposure. I'm not saying it right. That the parents want their child to be exposed only to the exact nusach that they themselves raised their children with, and therefore, I think it's much more of a problem actually in Eretz Yisrael than in America, where if the nusach of the bacher or the child, be it boy or girl, is a little bit not that of the other parent body, they feel that that's grounds to ask the child to leave or not come back the next year, and that's like the ultimate yotza schar b'efseda, because even if, let's say, there's a little bit more exposure for one child that comes from more modern background or whatever it might be to the normal nusach of the yeshiva, but the very negative viewpoint of being so hypercritical as to what is your nusach and what's not your nusach, for children to feel that degree of cynicism and chakiris and bedikas into different people's personalities is such a negative influence in the child. He's much more healthy being accepting of nischais, so that what you're gaining by protecting ki'ilu, your child, from different versions of Yiddishkeit, which might be a little bit more open, you might be very well losing by the fact that you're being hypercritical as to different type of nischais. You're much better off being more accepting as for making a child a healthy, happy, good Avodah Hashem.
Very nice. I just add on a story in that regard. I was once with Rav Tzvi Rotberg. Rav Tzvi Rotberg is the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva's Base Meir in Bnei Brak. He's a Karelitz. He's the grandson of Rav Meir Karelitz, the eldest brother of the Chazon Ish. And there was somebody who came and asked him the following question. He says, I'm a Baal Tshuva, and I send my child to the large right-wing yeshiva, Cheder, and I have a problem that when my son goes to other people's houses, they're seeing videos. And in fact, it's the Rabbanim's houses that they're going to. He's friends with the children of the Rabbanim, and they're the ones showing videos, and I don't allow that in the house. What should I do? So I was ready for Reb Tzvi to say to him, you got to take your kid out of that school. There's one place, send him to the Hasidic Kollel, to the Hasidic Cheder, that's going to be better for him. And Reb Tzvi said as follows, you should get your own video recorder, your own video machine, because at least in your house, when your kid is seeing videos, it will be under your supervision as opposed to when he goes elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the message. And I almost fell on the floor that I couldn't believe he was saying this, but it was such pichus, it was such brilliance to say, don't reject. Your kid is going to have those influences, but make sure that you're controlling, you have quality control under your supervision. So I think that fits in exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very nice. Thank you so much for having me. And
thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Neuberger. A real pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. I have known Joel for over 20 years, but I have actually never heard about his experiences in being expelled from school. So just to frame the conversation now, our objective here is also to hear what happened to Joel, but more importantly is to learn some important lessons from what Joel went through. Joel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward.
So, Joel, why don't we start off with the fundamental question to get some background. Tell us, why were you thrown out of school?
Well, I wasn't thrown out of one school. I was thrown out of 6 or 7 schools.
6 or 7 schools.
6 or 7
okay.
schools. Yeah. I call it the World Tour, the Joel World Tour. But, yeah, why was I thrown out? I was thrown out for simple reasons. For being dumb, like when they said you're stupid, you're not gonna work well in the school. 2, regular teenage misbehaving problems. Example, girls or a movie or something like that. So I just got thrown out of every school I went to. At the time when I was a kid, there was no such thing as ADD. You were just stupid or not stupid. So,
because I know you're not stupid at all. You happen to be incredibly intelligent. So I guess they meant you didn't have Sitzfleisch to be sitting there through class.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't fit into the mold of being studious because you couldn't sit. So that was one issue, and then probably being a little bit wild, not fitting into what they were looking for.
Correct. There's one school specifically which I remember clearly is I got thrown out of something I didn't do, and that is what really that was a dagger in my heart.
What happened there?
Somebody stole money from somebody, and at that time, I come from a family with a rabbi. We didn't get a lot of money, spending money in Israel, and I was in yeshiva, and I got accused of stealing money, and they threw me. They told me that if I admit it, then they're not going to throw me out. And I just didn't want to get thrown out because my parents would have killed me. And I didn't need the wrath from the school and from my parents. So I admitted it. I told them, yeah, I took the money. And the second I said that, they threw me out. And
oh boy,
that was really hurtful, and I'll never forget that. In fact, that school later on, when they found out I was making money, asked me to be like alumni of the year. They wanted to be honored.
How ironic!
Yeah.
How ironic. So walk us through 6 to 7 schools you were thrown out of. Were there warnings along the way? Were there attempts to correct the issues, or were they straight?
Very few. A couple of them just put into, you're in probation, or I was kicked out of the dormitory. I was not behaving at night. Sometimes I would stay out late. So in one yeshiva in Baltimore, they threw me out. And they said you have to just live in somebody else's house, which was actually very nice. I had very good cooked meals and stuff, and it was nice, but that wasn't their intention. And then when I went home for Pesach, they said he shouldn't come back.
So not serious efforts to get you back.
There was never go to therapy or something like that to see what's wrong, or take your ADD pills or whatever it is. There's nothing of that.
Now, do you think Do you think when things were going on in each of these schools that you were having a negative impact on your classmates, or is it simply that
I think it was a negative impact on myself. I don't think it was a negative. It wasn't like I was influencing other kids to do bad things.
So what were the rationale for throwing you out if you weren't having a negative impact on others?
Yeah, because simply when you're a kid and you just don't care. I never cared about any of my studies. I never took tests. I never did anything. I wouldn't show up for classes. I wasn't an angel. I'll tell you that. And so when I was doing these things, it's just not good to have for the school. It's just, if I was a principal, I would do the same thing if the guy didn't start, moving, doing something. Most of my expulsions were justified. I wasn't a good student, and I wasn't interested in studying. Mm-hmm. So I don't know necessarily I was holding the kids back, but I know that I was holding myself back, and they didn't want to have anything to do with that.
So when each time you were thrown out, did you say, okay, you're right, or were you upset?
I never said I was right. I thought it was more continue on your world tour.
So you were looking forward to the next city.
Yeah, I was looking for the next stop. I knew that I can't go home, so my father's a pretty well-respected rabbi. I figured that for sure they're gonna let me go to someplace else. Usually, it's a rabbi's son, blah blah blah. I was able to get into a lot of schools, and I had an opportunity to really continue my world tour.
Now, if we asked the principals at the 6 or 7 schools that expelled you, was Joel having a negative impact on the classmates, what would the principal say?
It's a good question. I can give you all the principals' names and numbers, and you can call them. But I don't think I was so bad to the classmates. No, I don't think I really affected the classmates.
So we have
to simply just not behaving myself and not doing the right thing.
So we have to think, what's the standard for expelling somebody? If it's negative to him, or is it when there is really a negative impact, a negative influence on the classmates, then maybe you shouldn't have been thrown out of each of these schools?
Well, let me make it clear. You should never be thrown out of a school. If I had a rabbi or something, and I'll tell you a story that stayed with me for life. And when a rabbi shows an interest, or a teacher or a principal shows an interest in a kid that's struggling, there's nothing that the kid wants to do more than make that rabbi proud. And I'll tell you, there was a time when I was a kid. I was in 4th grade at the time, and I will never forget this. That after school, all my friends were going to La Brea Kosher Market, and I couldn't really afford to get any money for that. So I figured that tzedakah boxes are for poor people, and I thought that I was poor. So when class was over, or school was over that day, I went into the tzedakah box, and I took a few dollars out, because I figured it's for poor people, and I really thought I was poor. So I really didn't even think I was doing anything wrong. And as I'm walking out of the classroom, I look in the window, and I see Rabbi Goldenberg from Torah U'Mesorah. I see him there, standing there. And I saw this face of disappointment. And he opens the door, he goes, "What did you do?" I go, "Nothing." Meanwhile, I had a pocket full of change. And he goes, well, what's in your pocket? I go, "Nothing." And I shake my pocket, and the change is there. He goes, "Open your, take out what's in your pocket." And I took out like $7 in change. And he goes, "What is it for? What do you need that for?" And he said that and I told him that I wanted to go to La Brea Kosher Market and get some snacks with all my other friends who families come from wealth, so it's easy for them to get $5 after school. Rabbi Goldenberg said, "Put the money back in the tzedakah box. Those are for poor people." And he took out a $5 bill in his pocket, and he handed it to me. He goes, Go with this." And that affected me until today. And in fact, I learned with this rabbi, still till today, for the last 20 years, I learned with him 3 times a week.
Wow. And he didn't judge you?
He showed he loved me. He didn't judge me. He didn't care. And he also explained to me that that's not for you. When in the reality, I thought it was for me.
And no punishment, nothing like that?
Nothing. He never even told my parents, nothing. And he gave me $5 out of his pocket.
They're going to find out.
Yeah, I guess they're going to. No, I actually, at one of my son's bar mitzvahs, I said the story. And Rabbi Goldenberg was there. But, because of him, I happen to think I would be, if rabbis behaved like that and showed a love and showed like an understanding, I think it would be incredible. But today, today it's, again, I'm going to go back to the last place that I got kicked out was for stealing something I didn't steal. And that really, really affected me. That was like, that I went off the derech after that. I was not good.
Mm-hmm. But until that last time, you were still on the derech.
Yes, I was still 100%. But this one was like, you know what? Forget you guys. You guys don't even understand anything. And then you lie to me. I couldn't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big blow for me.
That lack of yashrus was what really did it. Being treated unfairly.
Right, being treated unfairly or lying to me. Don't tell me that if I admit it, it's going to... And the funny thing is, after I got kicked out of the school, a few weeks later, there was more money stolen from people. And they actually got the guy. And
they didn't call you back?
No. God forbid. That would be too smart.
So, Joel, in all these experiences of being thrown out of schools, how did people typically react when they heard that you'd been thrown out of school?
They expected it. For me, it was like, oh, here it goes, next.
Uh-huh.
The only people that didn't really... people expected it, but they weren't excited about it. My parents were not happy. But
here we go again.
But yeah, they're like, oh no, now we have to start making phone calls again, and I don't know how much money and tuition that they lost also from all the schools that I went to. Maybe I should pay them back for that. And everybody else was like, oh, what school are you in now? Kind of became like a little joke.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Now, what would have made this process easier each time you got thrown out?
Which process?
Like when you got thrown out again, could somebody have reached out to you and say, Joel, I'm sorry to hear about it? Or
the rabbi that threw me out should have done that.
Did they help you find the next place, or they just
you were just out. You're out. It was very interesting because today that wouldn't fly. I don't think. I just don't see kids getting thrown out like I used to. 30 years ago, it just seemed like it was a normal thing.
Wait, did you have other friends who were getting thrown out of schools at the same time?
No, I didn't. I was the special one.
Now, looking back at this, because this is a couple decades ago or more, how has it impacted your life, or has it impacted your life?
Well, there's always some events that you feel like impact your life, right? And I feel like there's a few events in my life that have impacted mine, and one of those was for sure when I got thrown out of the yeshiva for stealing something I didn't steal. And I had a resentment for a very, very long time, and I went completely off the derech for years after that. I wasn't punishing anybody, but I said, if this is what I'm signing up for, this is not what I'm signing up for. I'm not signing up for this type of program. And I became very bitter, very angry at the yeshivas because I was like, look at the system failed me. You could have just reached out to me. You could have just known that I'm not like this, the regular cow in the herd. I needed a little bit special attention, and not only because I needed special attention, but also because I actually had learning disabilities. I'm diagnosed with dyslexia. It's very hard for me to read. I can't do certain things, and I'm ADD. So if I just got a little pat on the back and said how proud they are and stuff like that, I think things could have, been a lot more different as far as me going off the derech. But when I say off the derech, I still mean that Rabbi Goldenberg called me every single week to continue learning. So go back to the guys that are the good guys. There's always some. But yeah.
All right, so let me ask you one final question. I've heard of a few people who have been thrown out of a yeshiva, multiple yeshivas that turn into very successful people. You know, you went on Baruch Hashem, you've had success in your life also, have a beautiful family. Is it possible that the throwing them out of the yeshivas assisted them in some way, that they wanted to show that they were successful despite the adversity that they went through? Or is that these were specific yechidim, these were individuals that had certain personality traits of being successful and outgoing, etc., and that's why they got thrown out, but that's for the same character traits that they were eventually successful despite having been thrown out of schools?
That's an excellent question. I was always thinking outside the box. You know, when I was a kid, I would go to market and buy a pound of salami and then a loaf of bread and sell sandwiches in the school with two slices in there, and I'd sell it for $2 and I make $20. So I always was like entrepreneurial in that way. But when I got thrown out of yeshivas, I felt this as if they were telling me, you're dumb, you're stupid, you're never going to make it. And a lot of the teachers did tell me that. So it could be, in hindsight, it did give me it gave me a silent push where, you know, I wasn't doing it to spite them, but I was doing it because I knew I could. And now the teachers know I can't, so I have to really do it. And I think that a lot of the adversities in my life caused my success. You know, I went and ended up marrying a great girl. I have 3 beautiful kids. But I think that if I just was mowing my lawn in every yeshiva and just doing what I had to do, maybe I wouldn't have the drive that I have today. So I don't know really how to answer that question, but you know, I don't feel like it's a direct impact, but I do feel like it definitely gave me a silent boost.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, for most of the children out there, students who have been thrown out of school, it unfortunately acts in the opposite direction. It doesn't give them the boost, but it totally depresses and pushes them down.
Oh, sure. I used to have a group with boys that are struggling in yeshiva. I used to have in my house every Wednesday night. I used to have pizza and barbecues and stuff. Every Wednesday we had this group called Issues Anonymous, where I had a bunch of kids.
You were the mentor.
And I was the mentor, yeah, but it was like, and then it became a political thing. You know, people in the school, people in the local community didn't like it. But the point is that I had that, and I used to see these kids who were really, really struggling with schools and struggling with the rabbis and struggling with that. And I'll tell you, out of the 10, 15 kids that came, 2 or 3 are dead now.
Wow.
And maybe with a little bit more love, they wouldn't be there now. And like probably 3 of them are in rehab, 2 of them are off the derech. And it's crazy what these teachers what these yeshivas and schools could do by just ignoring them.
I guess the biggest takeaway here is the more we can reach out to these children that are having these challenges, and even if the decision and the difficult decision is made that they should be moved from the school, we need to assist them, continue staying in touch with them, and make sure that they have a place to land in a very safe way.
Correct. And also, it's think about it like if you're running a marathon with like a whole bunch of people together. And if one person falls, what's going to happen? They're not going to just continue running. A lot of the runners will come and just pick up that guy. And I feel like that's in the yeshiva world. When we're all running, man. We're all running, you know, through the yeshiva and this and that. When somebody falls or somebody feels ill, you gotta nurture them. And I think that is the most important part of the success of yeshivas that are doing good things now. I've heard yeshivas now that I wish were around when I was a kid.
Joel, this has been very eye-opening, and we really appreciate your joining the show. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to listening.
Joining us now is Rabbi Yisroel Grossberg, who is the former principal of Bnos Chaya Academy. commonly referred to as BCA, which is a girls' high school in Brooklyn for girls who have no other alternatives. He also runs an organization called Al Haderech to support parents whose children are almost close to being at risk. Rav Grossberg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to dive right in and ask you what types of things we'll start with girls, getting thrown out of school for.
Okay, so the world that we live in, there's a lot of tension between what's acceptable and what's going on in the world. One of the first examples that comes to mind, let's say, is cell phones. So many of the Beis Yaakovs and the yeshivas as well have very strict cell phone rules that are hard for some students to keep. Being caught with a cell phone that has internet capability very often is a reason to be sent out of the school. Usually, the step after the cell phone comes the person on the other side of the phone, which is a guy, the boyfriend-girlfriend relationships that get students into trouble. Then there are some students, interestingly but sadly, who just have given up. Their ability to make it academically it's too tough, and they stop coming to school or they stop producing in school. And often, the school just says you're not up to standard, and they're asked to leave.
Mm-hmm. So it's cell phones, boys, and various other issues as well.
Correct.
And we're talking New York, Lakewood, Brooklyn, etc., those areas as well.
So it's interesting. I deal primarily with New York and Lakewood, but very often some of the out-of-town schools have, we'll say, a bigger box for the student to fit into. And I've dealt with a number of other mechanchim who are dealing with these issues, and we've kind of self-studied and realized that the bigger the box, the less of the problem. So if you're in an out-of-town community that just has a greater tolerance in certain areas, there's less of an issue going on in that community, as opposed to in our communities where, Baruch Hashem, we've thrived in our Avodas HaKodesh and our Yiddishkeit, but the problem is not everyone can keep up to that standard, and it's a small box sometimes that students are pushed to fit into, and that's where the problems begin.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you say the same thing when it comes to boys being expelled from school? Are they the same reasons, or are there other reasons as well?
Generally, the same reasons. The taiva that's there, it's all around us. It's hard to say that, well, we just won't expose our children to movies, we won't expose our children to some of the influences of the outside world, because all a child needs is a couple of bucks, and he can really get it on his own. I've had many students come into my office, and the parents will promise and swear up and down, our child has no access to a smartphone. There's no way. And I'll call the child in and with a straight face look at him and say, okay, we know all about your smartphone. Let's make this easy. Please take it out and put it on the desk. Mm-hmm. And the parents will look at me like I'm crazy, and the kid looks, and he's all nervous, and he slowly his hand goes and he takes out that smartphone and puts it on the desk, and the parents are in shock. It's easy to get hold of, and once they get hold of, very often they can't hold back from letting their friends know. It takes one friend who knows, the class knows, the Rebbe knows, and it's a pretty fast downward spiral from there.
Wow. Now, after expulsion from these schools, where do the kids usually go? Is there another alternative for them? Do they get out on the streets? What happens thereafter?
So this is a problem that I strongly feel as a community we need to face. There really are very few alternatives. Interestingly, there are alternatives for the student that's really in trouble, and then there's the student that's mainstream and doing great. There isn't that much for the child who was asked to leave the school, but still is not at that stage where he needs to be in a school for kids that are struggling. Where does he go? And he or she go? And that's a problem. And I can tell you that I've had students come into my office in BCA, and after an interview, I said, Baruch Hashem, you don't belong here. Some of the issues that our students are struggling with, you're not struggling with. Why would I want to expose you to that? And they looked at me and said, well, where am I supposed to go? I was kicked out of that school. Out of town isn't an option. Where am I supposed to go? And I don't really have a good answer to that question. I actually have had students more than once who will say, well, what are the students in your school doing that I'm not doing? So I'll bring up some of the issues that are going, whether it be substance abuse that sometimes is going on or inappropriate relationships. And they'll look at me with a smile and say, okay, give me 6 weeks, I'll be back. because I want to be in school. So if that's what it's going to take to get into your school, I'll do it. True story. So
that really happened.
Yeah. So I'm saying, what we really do need to find there, and there are some schools.
At least you say, "I'll be back tomorrow."
Yeah, I guess they're giving themselves a little bit of leeway. But I understand there's nothing worse, and this really ties into the whole concept of expulsion. There's nothing worse than sitting at home, than seeing your friends get up and talk about their school day and putting on their uniform and doing everything. There's nothing more disheartening. There's nothing that really takes the neshama of a child and puts it through the ringer than having nowhere to go. To the point where a student sometimes would rather go to a school that's not a good fit. At least they have a place to go.
Right.
They wake up in the morning and have a place to go.
Right, so the girls in BCA, and I assume there are limited options other than BCA somewhere in New York. Right. What schools are they coming from, or what geographical areas are they coming from?
So I'd like to say that it's a true, if you want to get an idea of what Mashiach looks like, Mashiach's times will look like. We see a true kibbutz goliath. We have students from the most Satmar, I don't mean to pick on Satmar, but the most Hasidic communities to anywhere in the modern Orthodox world and everything in between. Unfortunately, this is an issue that doesn't necessarily thrive in one particular community. It's really all across the board.
Mm-hmm. And do you see, based on where they come from, that they have different challenges, or are they fairly similar?
So, unfortunately, I always say that sometimes the students they're the perfect victims. The more naive they are, the more they can be taken advantage of. The street is a very dangerous place, and it's a very short distance from being thrown out of school to living or being on the street. And they're taken advantage of. They don't know. Some of them are so naive and they're so emotionally vulnerable. They become the perfect victim for a predator. Emotionally vulnerable. You just have to say something nice and they're putty in your hands. Naive. So just say, yeah, this is okay, what we're going to do, etc. And, nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to be all right. And they listen. So it's really a danger. It's really a sakana. So I would say that, some of the students that are coming from the more sheltered backgrounds are more in danger of what they're doing on the street, what's going on in the street. But ultimately, it doesn't take long for, it becomes the great equalizer. They're all pretty much catch up with each other, shortly down the road.
Uh-huh. Now, of the girls that go to the BCAs of the world, because there are others as well, what percent were expelled from another school? Because I want to focus now on the expulsion side of things and the impact that being expelled can have on a student. So what percent would you say were actually officially expelled or not expelled from a school? Came of their own volition, I guess.
Right. I would say close to 80% were expelled. Different levels, sometimes the schools say, well, we didn't expel them, we just kind of felt that we came to an agreement and understanding that it wasn't a good idea. But a great many of them, are just, they're not invited back. And that in itself, right away, sets the tone for, sometimes how the child is going to look at schools, at Yiddishkeit even, right? That yeshiva becomes, that Beis Yaakov becomes the semel, becomes the standard of what Yiddishkeit is all about. And if they could do that to them, correctly or incorrectly, we're not saying that they're right for saying this, but Yiddishkeit did them wrong, and the rest becomes the trip down the road.
I guess that's because expulsion is rejection, and I was rejected. So that's the issue then.
Right.
So this may be a difficult question to answer, and I think it's also a difficult question to ask. I'll try to say it clearly. We're talking now about expulsion, and the question is, what's the impact that expulsion specifically has on a child? Because this is already a child that's dealing with a lot of issues. So is it that they were expelled and they were rejected that really throws a big wrench in, or these are people that already have, students that already have wrenches that they're dealing with? Right.
So I believe that how it's handled can make all the difference in the world. There's one particular Beis Yaakov in Brooklyn that I could think of, happy to say a positive thing, that they do it in such a way that the students have nothing negative to say about their school. And they even joke around one time, and the principal of that school will come visit BCA to visit their students. The principal is the principal of Kanaina, or a large school, will come just to see how their students, or they call them their students, are doing. And it really makes a difference. It was understood that these kids could not remain where they were. That's, that happens. That, no one's suggesting that a child that's, clearly in violation of all the rules of the school remains in the school without a care because we don't want to expel. That happens sometimes. But how it's done can make all the difference. Prior to my experiences in BCA, I was in mainstream chinuch, and I could say that some of the biggest nachas that I have from chinuch that happens to be coming up in a couple of weeks. I've been Mishpacha Kedusha in a number of Talmidim's chasnas, and it's, of course, a wonderful feeling, etc. But in a couple of weeks, I'll be Mishpacha Kedusha at the chasna of Talmid who I threw out of school, who I suggested leaves the school, but the kesher remained. He understood he had to go. To me, that's nachas. That's it's that idea. It sometimes has to be done. And sometimes, obviously, you need to take the rabbim over the yachid, which is, that's a halacha shayla that I'm not going to get involved in that. But even if it's done, it's how it's done that can make all the difference. Just to get an idea, though, what could be, we had a student who had to leave the dorm. The school has a dormitory, and she had broken a rule in a big way. And the decision was that she could no longer remain in the dorm. She was from out of town. She had told everyone that she had a place to sleep. Not to worry, we didn't ask her to leave the school, but the dormitory, that rule, the cardinal rule, had been broken. One of the people in the school did not have a good feeling about it and felt that maybe she didn't have a place to sleep. So they went out looking and found her in a park, sleeping on a bench. And she smiled and said, well, I did have a place to sleep. I didn't say where. That person took this student to their house and said, I'm going to put you in my basement. Now, you may get the wrong idea. Then think, okay, not so bad. I got kicked out of the dorm. Now I'm sleeping in someone's house. Said, please, let's make sure that you understand the severity of what happened. Fine. Fast forward a couple of years. This girl got married to a fine Ben Torah, turned her life completely around, and she needed a place to stay right after she got married because her apartment wasn't ready, and she ended up staying in this teacher's house. The same teacher, they were away for the summer, and she ended up staying in that same teacher's house. Right before left bench, the teacher gets a call, and the student is crying. He said, what happened? Did you break something in the house? She says, no. I said, I'm just thinking, the last time I was here because I was thrown out of the dorm. And now I'm benching licht in this same house. My husband, with his hat and his sefer under his, with him, went to shul. I just can't believe where I am. Thank you. And that's just what could happen.
So how is it typically done? Because if we have people that are winding up at these type of schools that have these negative feelings, apparently it's not being done in the most sensitive of ways. So how is it typically done? Do the schools, when they're expelling somebody, do they assist, find another school, or is it basically being thrown out on the street?
I will say that this is how the students are seeing things. I think it's important to bring that out because sometimes students see things through their own lenses, and it may be a little bit different than what's actually had taken place, but I always believe that we need to listen to what the student is perceiving because that's what we need to work with. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's really done in a very abrupt, we're sorry, you can't remain here, and as of tomorrow, you're out in the street, and that's it. And, I get to hear the horror stories. There are times where a student will open up to a teacher about something that's going on in their lives, a struggle that they're having, an assignment with Shabbos or something else, and all of a sudden they find themselves thrown out of school and they can't figure out. I opened up to this teacher for help, and instead it boomeranged, and I ended up back hearing from the Menahelas that I'm sorry, now that we know this information, you no longer can remain in the school. So there's a lot of pain that goes into the student opened up for the purpose of getting back on track, and unfortunately, it's not always pretty how the expulsion takes place. Sometimes principals would rather not become confrontational. You get a letter in the mail, that as of the next semester, this just happened right now. The states had winter vacation. We no longer feel that your student is a good fit for our school. We wish you much hatzlacha in the future. Have a nice day.
So the letter was to the parents? Saying don't send them anymore.
Right. When we come back after midwinter break, your student is no longer welcome here.
So what does a student do when trying to find a new school? Do you go and you say, help? Do you say, I got thrown out? Do you say, something's obvious then if you're looking in the middle of the year that something's problematic here.
One of the things that I beg schools to do is to just keep them to June. the difference between looking for a school in January and looking for a school in June is huge. Looking in January, you're doomed. You've been branded as a problem, and anything that you're going to say is not going to really make that much of a difference. And very often the student that's asked to leave in January sits home for 6 months, and the damage, like we said before, that's done in those 6 months is irreparable. In June, we decide to make a change, knowing that sometimes schools are actually helpful in that they don't need to share every last detail of what the child did in an effort to help the child get into a new school. Obviously, I don't think they should be dishonest. They shouldn't say the kid's wonderful if they weren't. But at the same time, they can be helpful. But once it happens in January, it becomes a real problem.
So that's a problem for the child, and that's also a problem for the parents of the child. So let's talk about how do parents handle a situation when a child has been expelled, either in the middle of the year or not in the middle of the year. But what's a parent's perspective on all of this?
So there's no other way to say it than that the tsar, the pain, is ein l'shayr. It's not to you can't measure it. I've spoken to parents and you eat it for breakfast, you eat it for lunch, you eat it for supper. It's your night chavrusa, it's your morning chavrusa. It's on your mind. You have a child that's sitting home, that's slowly slipping away. That very often comes with confrontation. They're now hanging out with the wrong crowd, and when you say, well, maybe don't hang out with those, that crowd. So, well, who am I supposed to hang out with? I was told that the school doesn't want me anymore. So you're telling me I can't have friends? And the parent doesn't. It is a very, very difficult situation for parents. And unfortunately, a parent once sent me a really, I don't know the way to say it, a terrible document, basically 5 reasons why I wish my child had cancer rather than they went off the derech. And number 1 is no one ever blames a parent for a child having cancer. And number 2 was there's all sorts of community support for parents who are dealing with a child who has Nebuch is dealing with the machla. There's programs for siblings who are going through this also. You got to realize there's siblings involved also. The girl goes back to school and says, "Oh, I didn't see your sister here anymore. Where is she?" What's she supposed to say? Who's helping her with that? And it can really, really put a tremendous toll on a family, on the shalom bayis, and unfortunately there really isn't much in the way of support. There's little patches here and there, but there isn't much in the way as a community for support for parents who are struggling with this. I think it's definitely a frontier that needs to be explored in terms of organizationally what we can do to help parents, not only with the resources, how to get a kid to school. Well, that is important. There are some people that are working on that, but just emotional support. It's such a painful thing for a parent to go through. And then there's also, I like to say, parenting a child who's going off is the equivalent of preparing and studying to go on stage. And you study and you spend nights getting your lines straight. And right before you go on stage, someone says, "Oh, by the way, it's going to be in Chinese. We changed everything." Okay, you're on. All the rules change, and no one is explaining to the parent what the new rules are. Mistakes are made, sometimes irreparable damage is done, and it becomes very difficult. It really, it's definitely something that needs to be explored. It's worse enough that the child feels expelled, but their last bastion of hope is their parent. And when their parent, just doesn't know how to express, and who can blame a parent for being disappointed? A parent is, but if they don't know how to express it in a way that it makes the child still feel whole, there's a lot of damage that can be done.
Give me an example. Does a parent say, "I'd like you back by 3 a.m. I'd like you back by 1"? Do they put restrictions, obviously limited restrictions on? They say their child is coming back drunk. Do they say, "I don't want you drinking"? Or is it you have to just be quiet, not say anything, which is obviously incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for a parent?
So there are a lot of shittas. I mean, this goes a little bit off the topic of expulsion, but there are a lot of shittas in this area. Some more liberal than others. But I believe that the concept of the derech emsois, of being somewhere in the middle, is really the way to go in terms of. And one of the terms that I use often is you have to ask yourself, do you want to be right or do you want to be successful?
In Hebrew we say, do you want to be tzodek or do you want to be chacham?
Okay, exactly. I got to remember that one. But that's exactly it. Yes, you're 100% right that your child should be home at a normal time. But if you're going to go now and make a big deal out of the time that he came home, the relationship is shot, and anything in the future now is it's growing. You're trying to build on very shaky ground. But if you can keep that foundation, just recently speaking to a student who is doing great, and the saddest thing is she truly feels she's returning, but in her words, but I have nowhere to return to, which is sad. And the truth is, at this stage, no judgment here, but I don't know if her parents even can appreciate the return that she's making, because it's not necessarily returning to the form of Yiddishkeit that they were hoping for her. So it's very difficult.
So talk to me about how we can help the students once they've been expelled. Love from the parents. What can we do to support them during this difficult time?
Right. I think a lot of it's even in the wording, expelled. If we can just say that we're going to try to find the right school for you, we're doing the exact same thing. Use the word expulsion. If the principal can do it in a nice way, it can be done in a way, and this is not chas v'shalom, I'm not here to knock the principals. They have an impossible job. And, they're working under tremendous stress, and, people have to realize that they have an entire parent body that's pressuring them, that if there are forces in a class, my daughter came home from school and she learned some things that she probably shouldn't have learned, why is this child still in class? The principal's in an impossible position. So I think it's important, it's very easy sometimes to knock the institutions, knock the principals, but, they are in a very, very difficult spot. So, expulsion and asking a child to leave has its place. Not every child belongs in every yeshiva, but sometimes how it's done can make all the difference in the world. I had a case in BC where a principal actually came with the student for her interview. She came with the student for her interview. It made all the difference in the world to this kid. I mean, obviously, she couldn't claim that she was just being discarded by her old school. But unfortunately, that's not so common. That's
amazing. Talk to me about the girls who go through these schools, the BCAs of the world, and now we're 5-10 years later. I assume we have some successes and unfortunately some still not successes. Tell me about what you've seen when the girls have gotten out, what happens to them.
Right. So, Baruch Hashem, as you mentioned, successes, we have had some major successes, some cases of girls that have not have just returned, but have returned stronger. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact, one of the things I talk to the girls a lot about is actually from last week's parasha, Zek Keli Van Veu. It has to be Zek Keli. It's my God. It's my connection to Rabbi Shalom. That sometimes someone can go through 4 years in Beis Yaakov and do great on all their tests, etc., and somehow still miss the boat with a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But these girls who are coming back on their own terms, they have a very strong relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They chose now to come back. They made these difficult decisions, and they're in a fantastic place. So we have girls that we have Kail wives. We have one girl who is interesting. I hope to visit at some point, but she sent me her chasna picture. The chasna's dressed all in white. She got married in Svas to a Talmud of Reb Nachman, and wasn't maybe what her parents had in mind, but this is what worked for her. So Baruch Hashem, we have had successes. We've had, and I want to clarify that's I measure success maybe differently than others do, in that if a child is happy and is healthy, I believe that the Keli is there for the Yiddishkeit to fall in. Earlier on in my career, working with this population, I think I was pushing Yiddishkeit, and it wasn't going anywhere. Now we just push happiness and health, and I really believe, and I more than just believe, I've seen that it falls in. The Yiddishkeit happens almost Me'ei Love, and we have to be patient. We have to know when it's going to come, and realize that everyone is, we use the term on their journey, but it's going to come.
Mm-hmm. Now talk to me about shidduchim. Obviously this is being expelled and going through what they call off the derech is not good for shidduchim. So how does this process impact that for the girls?
Right. So this is really one area where I believe that girls and boys are in two very different camps. I hear it from the girls because they're a little bitter about it. A guy can go through all his stuff, and stuff can mean all different things. Go to learn yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael for a year, come back
after the stuff.
Yeah, after the stuff, come back, sits out, his pay is behind his ears, and he's a hero. And girls are branded for life. That's how they see it, and very often they're not so far off. They'll always be remembered as the way they dressed or the things that they did, etc. And they talk about that girl who said she's returning but doesn't have where to return to. There are many girls who feel that way. Many of them remain, let's say they go to Eretz Yisrael and that's where their growth will take place. They remain in Eretz Yisrael because they feel that going back to their previous community, they cannot they cannot succeed. But what's interesting is that I found that many girls and many boys, and boys who sometimes will be read, will quote-unquote mainstream shidduchim, not necessarily people with a past, realize they need someone who understands them, who understands their nisyonos, who understands their growth, who understands, for someone who never had the dream to pick up a cigarette, to celebrate that someone is 2 years without a cigarette, it just, they can understand it. Or cigarette can mean all sorts of other things that are smoked. So sometimes they feel that although the goal isn't necessarily, let me just erase my past and go marry someone mainstream. I want to marry someone who understands me, who gets it, who understands my nisayon, possibly went through the same nisayon, and together. But they're building beautiful homes, Baruch Hashem. Really, they're doing good work.
All right. Thank you so much, Rav Grossberg. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. My pleasure. If I could just end with one thought that I want to get in there. This goes back to my high school days in the Mir Yeshiva High School. There was something that had taken place in the school, and I don't even remember exactly, some nifl peh written on the wall. There was a question about someone being thrown out, and everyone was waiting for the psak. I had tried to reach the banal that day. I had something that needed to get signed, totally unimportant, and by the fourth time I asked the secretary, I said, "Where is he?" She says, "Don't you know? He went to Yaakov Kamenetsky in Muncie to ask a shaila about asking this child to leave. Dinei nefashos, he wouldn't even do it on the phone. He got in his car, he wasn't a young man, he drove to Muncie, spent 5-10 minutes at Yaakov Kamenetsky, and came back. And the truth is, the decision was to ask the child to leave. But it was dinei nefashos, and so I think that if we're looking for a model of how to make decisions like that, we don't have a Yaakov Kamenetsky anymore, not everyone has to necessarily drive to Muncie, but it has to be that mindset, that before making a decision like that, that's what we do. To understand the severity of the issue. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Joining us now is Rabbi Yoel Kramer, who was the principal of Bnos Chaya Prospect Park Yeshiva, known famously as Prospect Park, for 35 years, and subsequent to that, he worked for a placement program by Torah U'Mesorah, assisting students in being placed in schools when those students have academic, social, and or behavioral challenges. In addition to all of that, in his spare time, he has led the Merkaz Center for Teacher Training for 40 years, and he also acts as a consultant day in, day out, elementary school, high schools, to many schools, dealing with the many questions that we are going to be discussing today with him and throughout this show. Rabbi Kramer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, Rabbi Kramer, on this show, we are speaking with various individuals who have different roles in dealing with the students when they have challenges. For example, people who have run high school programs who take students who have been expelled, or post-high school programs for such students, or Torah U'Mesorah, who coaches schools dealing with challenging students. We've even have students on the show itself who have been expelled. So we'd like to speak with you as the role of somebody who was a principal for many years, and not only that, but continue to coach, to train, to consult to many schools on the various issues that we are talking. So before getting into expulsion specifically, let's start with a more general question. And before expulsion happens, if there's an issue with a child, if a child is misbehaving, what steps can be taken to rectify the situation short of expulsion?
I'm glad you ended your question with the last statements, because basically expulsion is similar to extraction of a tooth or surgery. No good dentist or doctor deals with the extreme first, but they think first in terms of what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen. In the case of a school, when I train teachers, I tell them you are required, just as you have a lesson plan each day and you write down what you're going to teach, for every week you have to write down what students you're going to see. There is no such thing in these times that a Rebbe or a Mora teaches a child without making one-on-one contact. Most of the research and my finding is that one can identify the potential problem and expulsion student in as early as grade 4. Therefore, a teacher who is spending time with the child can see the seeds of this. And just like using my mashal, just like before, when there's a cavity, if you correct it and you fill the cavity, then there's no extraction. Similarly, parental meetings, parental programs in service where teachers are sensitive and are directed by guidance counselors or therapists to know what to look for. This basically is the way to prevent and therefore make sure that we don't come to an expulsion situation.
Mm-hmm. So general prevention, when you see there's an issue as early as fourth grade, be proactive and preventive before it becomes a ben sorah or mora.
Exactly.
Uh-huh. Now, the challenges that you see, and I'd like to hear also about some of the challenges that we see nowadays in the later year elementary school, high schools. If you can walk us through what are some of the challenges we're seeing. I assume it's smartphones and drugs, etc. If you can give us some insight into that. And also, I'd love to hear if there's a difference between the problems that are caused by girls versus boys in the schools nowadays.
Basically, there's never one cause. There may be many, many different causes. I'll list them as I do when I train the Rebbeim. The cause may be a home family situation. The cause may be a physical problem. The cause may be a learning problem. It may be a social problem. The cause may be a curricular problem, and I'll explain that in a moment. The cause, let's throw in also the child's bechira. While we're busy blaming so many different causes, there are times that the child is just the Baal Taiva and not ready to conform to the Torah requirements. Let me get back to curricular. Very often, and that's why it starts as early as the younger grades, the curriculum is a one-size-fits-all, especially in the case of the boys' world. In the yeshiva world, the problems begin to emerge in the fifth grade. Once we introduce Torah Shabbat Peh, and the boy cannot hack it, and his kishra may not hack it, there may be something in the way, and most of the day, fifth grade and up, is Torah Shabbat Peh. So therefore, he tries, and after a while, the feeling of failure and no stimulation drives him to look for other stimuli, which can be mild ones and eventually very, very heavy ones. The problem is so much more exacerbated nowadays because so much more is available, so much more is enticing. It's a very salacious world, and therefore we see more problems in the boys' world because of the curriculum and the school. If a school would be proactive, or if parents were proactive, and placed the child in a school that maybe had a milder curriculum and catered to the individual, you'd see less of it. In the girls' world, you see there's less of a curricular course. A girl can excel on the stage in arts and crafts, in chesed projects and such. In the boys' world, as much as we tell it to them, the reality is, if you don't steig and you're not mitzuyan in learning, then the implication is you're not really making it. You're a potential failure.
So if you're not good in Gemara, you're a failure.
Exactly. Especially when Gemara is, by the 7th, 8th, 9th grade, 90% of the day in most chadarim. Of course, the solution there is to find a cheder where it's not, or a rebbe where it's not, or where they provide for individual differences. There's a resource room, there are parallel classes, etc. In the girls' world, at the start, it's they're less driven to it. Later on, if we're comparing boys and girls, later on, the girls' world is harder to deal with. And most of my experiences volunteering with high school girls who have dropped out, are thrown out, etc. There it's a bigger problem. Boys, there are more boys rehabilitative, if we can use the term, opportunities. There are so many more mesiftas, and in each of the large metropolises and out of town, there are much less for girls. In the Lakewood that I live in, there's almost nothing that exists for girls until they hit bottom. So you have a much greater problem. Boys also can be sent out of town. A girl, the average girl, doesn't get sent out of town. And I know the country and the opportunities. There are minimal schools that are catering to the problem child and providing. There are almost very few dorms, maybe one or two in the whole country, and the average girl won't be sent away from home. So at the start of the problem, the boys' world is more problematic. Later on in the problem, the girls' world is more problematic.
Now, to get back to this list, home family problems, physical issues, learning challenges, social challenges, curricular challenges. It seems to me that one that really sticks out the most and possibly I would think is the hardest to deal with is the Bechira nonconformity issues. Is that correct? Because this is the one that is, the rest of them aren't, I would call it the fault of the child, and the Bechira is caused by the child, the student himself or herself.
Very, very true, very subtle, very true. And this is where the house has to come in. The house has to come in. Why is this happening? Is there something going on in the house? Is there an exposure in the house? And here we get into all of the social media. Are the opportunities there? Or more than that, this is a separate discussion, are there good, solid value messages coming from the house? Or is Tati and Mommy living in different worlds from each other, or different worlds inside versus outside? Are they playing the role and not really being it? And the young child sees this, picks this up, either subtly or even more grossly, and begins to move in that direction. And this is a major issue. Parents, where the discussion of expulsion invariably ends up focusing on the school. And I'd love to throw it back also and say, parents, where are you and what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't happen or to identify it early enough?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
it's a totally separate discussion, but the monster in the room is shidduchim. That's really where a lot of our societal problems end up in. There's a major concern with that, more so with girls than with boys, and we understand why. And when decisions are made totally based on that, then it's disaster. It's a dead end street, and very often parents will not do what they should be doing because of the concern of shidduchim for the child, the presenting child, or for siblings in the house. I've had experience where parents will not allow a child to go into a solid remedial program because that will do to my present child who's Isaac and shidduchim. And what will people say? How will it look on the resume? We can go
right. So we have a korban. We have a korban here.
Yeah, exactly. This is not random. This is very, very common.
So at what point do we say that a student needs to go?
Okay, we're jumping. I don't believe in expulsion. I don't
at all.
At all. I don't. In my career, I don't recall ever, quote, expelling a student from the school. And it was a very large school, a very popular school, and it had a broad range of student body, which means I was challenged. It wasn't just a very heterogeneous situation. And yet, I don't believe. We don't expel from home. If we have a problem child, we expel the child. There are times that it happens, but that's not the proper derech. We don't expel from Klal Yisrael. The danger of expulsion is you basically are expelling them from Klal Yisrael. Let's take the steps very, very clearly. The child is thrown out of school. The child feels broken. I've heard girls say, they made me feel like a shmata. They made me feel like a shiksa, so I will act like one. And there it is. There it is. The anger that sometimes comes out. It's healthy when it comes out right away. Often it's undercover and comes out much later, sometimes even in adulthood. So they're thrown out. And then the reality is that if they live in a somewhat larger community, they can't go to any other school. No school will take the expelled student, except for the major rehabilitation school. And that I can send my child there because what will everybody say? So here we are.
Right. So how do we deal with the situation when a student is having a very negative impact on the other students in the class, for example?
So the K'nei Midah, has been in the past, the barometer has been Chaytei Umachti. Chaytei Umachti, therefore the child cannot be there. But that doesn't mean we expel them. A person could be a Machti, so the Chaytei Umachti, so in a classroom, so let's remove that child from the regular classroom. And so there may be a choti down the hall on a different floor, in a different room, in a different program, but the machti is not there anymore. So
where do they go? Where are they sent?
So number one, okay? Number one, the school can do something about it. I've had where we separate. We identify and we have them in small groups. Once again, dealing with them, master mechanchos, master counseling, and help them through it. Step number one. Another would be where there's a reciprocal program. Two schools of equal level decide, I'll take yours and you'll take mine, short of taking an neshama and throwing it into the street. Number three would help find a school. Help find a school. In rare cases, I recall, where a student had to leave. Once again, I don't use the term expelled, but had to leave. We help them find that it's the achrayus of the school that is suggesting that a child leave to find an alternative. Just as a parent can't say, it's not my job, the school can't say it too. If a child is a child, if a student is a child, I've had ones where we homeschooled 3 girls who did egregious things in April. We homeschooled from April through June, and we sent work home. They had to send it back again. They came in for major tests. This was in New York State. They came in for regents at the end and for major finals. So they were not thrown out. They were chutz lamachne, but they were still in the school. One-on-one remedial is certainly a way of doing it educationally and socially. here I gave you 4 or 5 ways of dealing with it that do not enter the world of, quote, expulsion, throw out neshama.
Right. Those were very creative, I have to say.
And we did it. And it was successful. And many of them, none of them come back and say, I hate you, you killed me religiously, it's all your fault. I recently read a book of a Chassidish man who went off to derech. I cried because it was so sad at so many points in his development. If somebody had just reached out to him, talked to him, and interceded, and directed him away from the strict chassidus that he was in, we still would have had an neshama. And now here's this. What was sad about it also, he wasn't angry, and he's sad. And I've spoken to someone who knows him presently, and they say his whole existence is filled with sadness. That's good. And when there's anger, most of those books are angry. Then there's no. It's uvas lo yuchaliskan.
So I guess your message is to mechanchim, to principals, let's find a creative way to make it work so the child, the student, as egregious as what they're doing, does not feel rejection.
Right. I want to add also that sometimes you can involve the child in deciding what to do. There are times, to use the term loosely, there can be self-expulsion, where the child says, this is not the place for me. I don't want this. But and then work with the child and saying, what can I do? Where can I find a place that will help you? So even if the child leaves the school, the child is part of the process and the decision, and not thrown to the dogs religiously and spiritually.
Oh, Rabbi Kramer, this has been very helpful and very creative. I appreciate the creativity that you have. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Joining us now is Rabbi Shmuel Yaakov Klein, who is the Director of Publications, and he has many other tasks as well for Torah U'Mesorah, which is affiliated with almost 800 day schools in North America. That means 20,000 teachers. Before his 12 years at Torah U'Mesorah, Rabbi Klein spent 22 years as a menahel and another 12 as a rebbe. Rabbi Klein, additionally, in his spare time, is a popular author and speaker and has extensive experience in child and adult education. Rabbi Klein, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Rabbi Klein, thank you for joining us. To frame the conversation, I assume most people know what Torah U'Mesorah does, but if you could just give us a minute or two on the length of what Torah U'Mesorah does, reaching out, working with the schools and the teachers, that would be very helpful for us.
Sure. I think it's important to begin with just a historical perspective, and that is that Torah U'Mesorah was founded almost exactly 75 years ago. Founder was Reb Shlomo Feifel, Mendelovich Zechat Tzadik Livrocha, whose vision was to avert, I think, what he would have referred to as a different kind of a Holocaust in America, Holocaust of children not being raised in a Torah environment, and there was enough devastation in America because of that very fact, so he tried to avert any additional damage, so to speak. So the idea was to found schools in basically any community, 5,000 kids or more. So that was really the first undertaking of Torah U'Mesorah, to found schools. But over the years, of course, the organization evolved and does a plethora of wonderful things. The problem that we have, if one can refer to it as a problem, is that we do all of what we do behind the scenes. It's not mamish in people's faces, like other organizations are a little bit more popular because what they do is more community-based. We are school-based. We're serving schools, we're serving mechanchim, we're serving the Olam HaChinuch, which in turn is exposed to the tzibur. So we have the school establishment, in a sense, as a buffer between what we do and between the tzibur. But what we do basically is a lot of things. I'm particularly involved with the materials for schools, but we have divisions on Holocaust education, which I'm involved with. We have teacher centers all over North America. We even have one now for the last couple of years in Manchester, teacher centers, which offers an opportunity for teachers to come in to help develop their curriculum, to develop their bulletin boards and other materials for the creativity aspect of teaching, which is extremely important today. We mentor leaders of schools, that's principals. There's also teacher mentoring. There's teacher training. There's placements, which we serve basically as shatchonim between moistus that need to fill positions and between people who are looking for positions. We have regional and, of course, the big national conventions. There's only one of those which is really oriented at fundraising, and but that's not by far the biggest one that we have. And the biggest one we have provides professional development, workshops, opportunities for growth. And as I said, just a whole lot of things that are done, but primarily behind the scenes. I don't know if that puts the proper spin that you're looking for, but that's really what I have to say about Torah U'Mesorah.
It's very helpful. So mentoring teachers, supplying tools to teachers. If you have a teacher that comes to you, or you're teaching a workshop to teachers, and the issue is dealing with problematic students, what we can call a bad apple, at least looking like a bad apple in the classroom and being very disturbing to others and possibly having a negative impact on the other students in the class. What specific advice do you give teachers on how to handle those situations?
So I can speak primarily for my own self, but I think probably share the same premises with my colleagues here. The first and foremost point is that we need to understand that aberrations in behavior, which is what we're speaking about in this question, stem from something. There's no unexplained incorrect behaviors. So the idea is to try to search out. In fact, this question was posed to the Rosh Yeshivas, and I failed to mention in my little introduction before, and that is that all policies are formulated by what we refer to as our Vad Rosh Yeshiva. In other words, everything that Torah U'Mesorah does in terms of a mahalach, in terms of an approach, is founded on Das Torah from the leading Gedolei Yisrael in America. So this question came up before Gedolim, and the question was whether the Malamed or the Maora has an obligation or a right, let's start with the right, but even an obligation to look into personal lives of the Talmidim when there is deviational kind of behavior. And the answer was a resounding yes. It's a chiyuv, that's what we need to do. So what I always tell people is try to understand that every bad behavior comes from something, and to try to find out what that is. And I can give various examples of that, but now I don't think is the right time or venue to do that. But that comes up in workshops, that comes up in presentations, and the teacher mentoring. A mechanech, I think, plays a very personal role, as I mentioned, almost a parental role. That's related, I guess, to the challenges that the Olam faces in parenting skills today. In fact, Torah U'Mesorah is involved with the parenting initiative, which is a very large and broad scope, Baruch Hashem. But the need for that is greater today than it was, let's say, 20 years ago, because parents don't have necessarily the wherewithal. So the mechanech steps up to the plate, fills in a little bit of that gap. The idea also is to deal with the kids by motivating them. I think that's one of the difficulties. It's a misnomer to think the kids are not motivated in general. They are. The shaila is motivated for what, or to do what. So the idea is to teach teachers the skills to motivate kids in their learning. The idea is also to collaborate with kids in finding out solutions. In other words, if a child has some sort of a quandary, some sort of a problem in terms of his or her behavior, and solutions are needed, it really ought not to be a unilateral, one-directional thing coming from the teacher, from top to down to the student of what you have to do or what you should be doing, or rather to collaborate and to jointly figure out solutions to problems. The vast majority of problems are solvable in this way. I also personally tell teachers that they should not diagnose. In other words, if all of conventional means, and even slightly not conventional means, have been attempted with little success, the teacher should not lower himself to diagnosing, saying this kid is this label, that label. Today we're throwing around labels as if it's matzah Wasser. We shouldn't be doing that. don't diagnose, but first discuss with the menahel or the menahelas, and then, if need be, then other kinds of outside help should be entering into the equation.
So what I'm hearing is understand the issue because there's something underlying the lack of behavior, and also motivate. Work to motivate the carrot, or start with the carrot, attempt the carrot as opposed to the stick. I think that's what you're saying. So given that, if the carrot is not successful, we're not able to inspire that kid, and that student is negatively impacting the classroom environment, how do we balance the consideration of this child not being appropriate for the class, asking him to leave the school, damaging potentially his self-esteem, is from kai potential shiduchim, with also his staying in the class, thwarting the ability of the teacher to teach properly and for the other students to be able to learn properly. So how do we balance this, the yachid versus the rabbim versus the tzibur?
It's actually a very important question, and let me begin by just saying or sharing an experience I had with Rabbi Leib Steinman years ago. This is back in my Toronto days. We had a kinus of Mechanchim. He happened to be in town. He came together with the Ger Rebbe for Chizuk of Moistis, or whatever it is in Eretz Yisrael. And there was an asifa with Rabbi Leib with over 200 Mechanchim in Toronto. And one of the questions that was posed, and I acted as the conduit, and I translated the questions into Yiddish to him, and I translated his Yiddish response back into English for the Oilam, although most of them understood Yiddish, but nevertheless, that's neither here nor there. So the question was, what do we do about children who are dragging down the class and the stature of the class, the status of the class? Now, that was more oriented towards learning, but I think the same thing can be used in terms of behavior. So the question is, can that child or should that child be removed? So he smiled at me and he said, absolutely not, because when that child's removed, somebody else will just slip into that same place. So it's a never-ending issue, and the approach is not just to sever that limb or to cut out that so-called bottom stratum of the class population. That doesn't work. Now, in terms of asking a child to leave a school, I mean, that's dinei nefashos, obviously. We're talking about matters of life and death, which, as you suggested in your question, can impact on a child's future, on his reputation, ultimately on such things as shidduchim, etc., etc. So it's not something that can be taken lightly by any means. In some cases, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit later, I'm not sure if it'll come up, but in some cases which are extreme and there seems to be no other alternative, so maybe asking a child to leave a school, not a class. A class is less of an issue, especially if there are parallel classes. You can try the kid with a new haschala in a different class, a parallel class. That's much less of a problem. We're here talking about removing a child from the school. So obviously the Olam HaChinuch, the Menahel and the Melamed, particularly the Menahel, I guess, because it would be his decision, have an achrayus for the Yochid as much as they have an achrayus for the Rabbim. Or almost as much. In other words, if a child, let's say, is a mashchis, some of the things that I said we'd get into a little bit later, where there's hashchasa, and it's almost incontrovertible, and it's getting worse, then obviously something has to be done, and in the extreme case, even removing a child from that situation. But there are stories we've heard of Gedolei Yisrael who advised to do those kinds of things. There's one case with Rav Shach, I think, who said that a child had to be removed, and he guided the menahel of a particular school to do that. But he himself spent time with that child, I think every day, if I remember the story correctly, learning with the child and helping also to place the child in another school. So in other words, weeding, if I can use that expression, and I probably shouldn't, but weeding a child out of that situation and ridding yourself of the sense of achrayus towards him is absolutely not conscionable, and that should definitely not be done. So even in the case where a child really must be removed, there's an achrayus. I mean, there's stories of people who used to fast. I mean, I would fast tainis yochid before coming to that kind of decision. But again, what's important is to seek the advisement of a Gadol B'Yisrael. It can't be done wantonly, and we do hear occasionally of stories of schools where I guess the menahel or the menahelas felt that there's no other recourse and acted a little bit too rashly, a little bit too quickly, and maybe trifle irresponsibly. You don't hear often these things happening, but occasionally it does, and that has to be avoided. But so I'm giving you a parva answer. In other words, sometimes, for lack of choice, that has to be considered, but it has to be considered in the right way and with the right incidental kinds of measures. Achrayus for the yochid, placing him in another school, spending time with him, not giving him the sense that he is chalila v'chas being tossed into the so-called wastebasket, but is only done if it's completely proven that it's for the toilets of the school, toilets of the tzibur. Yeah.
So I do want to get back to what are valid reasons to expel a student, but before that, I want to continue with what you're talking about. Assuming that decision has been made, eitzes have been taken, Gdolei Agdor, Gdolei Poskim have been consulted. What's the specific process in informing the parents, informing the child? I assume the parents are already understanding that there are problems with this child at this point.
Yes, right. So obviously there's a process which includes most things which are fairly obvious, and that is verbal warnings, sometimes even written warnings, meetings, first of all with the child, him or herself, with the parents, sometimes with the rov of that community that the child is a member of, and there has to be due diligence with professionals. Which means in the case where it's assumed that there might be some mental health issue which is affecting the behavior of the child, then a responsible and an understanding mental health professional should be called into the equation, which usually means, hopefully, if there exists in the community, but a frum psychologist who shares the same values as the school and maybe part of the same community, but who understands what might need to be done. So there's due diligence with outside help, with professionals. Due diligence with the child. There's all sorts of different things that can be tried with the child before a decision is made. So again, what I would, if anyone's listening to this in terms of taking it as advice, I would certainly advise not to do things quickly. There's a lot of things that can be done with a child, whether it's creating a contract with him or just speaking with him, being personally involved with him. That's what I call due diligence with the child. So there's different kinds of things that have to be followed up, both by seeking outside intervention and by dealing with the child himself. And again, it's very important that if and when the decision is final and it's made after a lot of effort and a lot of deliberation and a lot of soul-searching, then certainly part of the process is to try to ensure that the child can be placed in another moiset, because just cutting the ties and letting him float off into outer space probably is irresponsible. I remember there was when I was in Manayil in Toronto, in one of the schools that I served in that capacity. So there was another school where a child had been a student there and was not doing well. I'm not going to go into all the situations or all the circumstances. The child was not doing well in that other school. And that school made the recommendation, or took the decision basically that they have to let that child go. But before they did that, they contacted us, my school, and to try to beg that we take the child in, and we did. Baruch Hashem, it happened to be a marvelous move because the child not only became totally socially adjusted in the new setting, but flourished academically and in all respects, and it happened to be a good move. But I would commend that other school. Of course, commendation without a name is almost half-baked, but I'm not going to name the school. But certainly commend people who do that kind of a thing. Before they ask a child to leave where it's absolutely necessary, to make sure that there is some base kibul at the other end of the process who's going to welcome the child.
Right. Now, that's very commendable that you took that child. I would think that's more the exception than the rule. I'm
not sure that that's the case. There are communities where that's certainly a par for the course. One thing that comes to mind is, I think, I'm not sure what the name of the organization might be, Kahal, possibly, but I think Rabbi Bender in Far Rockaway was behind that, making some sort of an organization or an understanding among Menalim that they will deal with individuals who are slightly challenging to a particular school, that it should not be a situation which involves only that school and that child, but rather that everyone gets into the act and everyone takes collective responsibility. So that at the end, there isn't a child without a school. And that affects various kinds of situations, not only this kind. Whatever. Maybe we'll get into that later as well. So I don't know if it's the rule. Again, I tend to have, having been involved in chinuch and for now altogether for about 45 years, 46 years, I tend to have not a terribly bleak view or negative view as to what mechanchim do. For the most part, mechanchim are responsible. Yes, occasionally you hear a story and it gets everyone's back up. That shouldn't have happened. But for the most part, I think these things are that I described earlier. Those things are happening, so they would be not the exception, but rather the rule, where there are some exceptions to that rule. But they are the rule. The good stuff is the rule.
Now, why don't we go back, and thank you for that, and I'm happy to hear that. What are valid reasons to expel a student? And as a gloss to that question, if a student is not disturbing in a class but has other issues, is there going to ever be a reason to expel that student? They have a different hashkafa. They were raised differently, different awkward social skills. I don't know what the example would be, but not negatively impacting other students, but don't belong in the school. Would there ever be a valid reason to expel such a student?
I don't think that would ever be a valid reason to expel a student. By the way, I'm a little bit reticent to give a formula of what constitutes a scenario which justifies expelling a student, because just for fear of anyone possibly either misunderstanding or abusing the words that I say and saying that, we even heard it on a program, that's not something I'd rather do. But all I can say is that hashchosa of a tzibur is the kind of problem that really would have to be dealt with in this respect. Again, upon advisement, upon soul searching, and the rest of the things that we prefaced earlier. Hashchos of a tzibur. If a child's hashkafas are not like that of the school, or like that of many of the kids in the school, in my view, that's not a reason. On the contrary, I can't give you a percentage because this isn't research. I can't have any statistics or data. However, I will tell you that probably half of today's Haredische millennials, or baby boomers, my generation, who are today, Baruch Hashem, Shemei Torah Mitzvahs, and B'nai Torah and B'nai Aliyah, may have begun their lives not fitting into the mold of the school that they were sent, and just picked it up by being in that school. So inclusionism is a philosophy that I think that we have to aspire to, and that should not be a reason to expel a student, especially if there's a matzav in a school where you have the roiv, you have the majority, if not the vast majority of the school represents a certain positive Yiddishkeit ideal, and you have some yechidim in that school who are liable to be influenced l'toiva by being in that environment, then you probably have very few mitzvahs in the world that compare in value to allowing that child to stay in that school. That some Seforim refer to that as Hashavas Aveda, where the child's neshama may be a little bit lost, and by keeping him in that environment, you are returning the neshama to the child. That's a tremendously positive thing, and very seldom. Of course, that being said, when a child is asked to register in a school, or parents are registering their child or children in a school, they lechatchila should try to seek an environment or a school environment which is going to be most appropriate for their child and for themselves. That being said, if that's not always the case, or in the event that we're speaking about a community school, which is supposed to be more encompassing, more welcoming, then those would be the exceptions. But lechatchila, if there's a choice of schools in a community, parents should seek the school that's best in line. But once a child is in, to ask a child to leave because an aspect of Yiddishkeit which is not going to disrupt the lives of others, not going to be bad influence on others, should not be a reason to ask a child to leave a school.
So the one real variable we're looking at is the real negative impact on the other students in the class.
Correct.
Okay. One last question for you. We've been talking, I guess, primarily about elementary schools. Do all these concepts apply to high schools as well?
I would say yes. A couple of provisos to that, however, and that is sometimes negative behaviors become more pronounced when the child gets older. They're more visible. We as kids are a little bit more in your face. They're a little bit more bold. So you can detect them a little bit easier. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should be reacting in kind. We still have to have the same reservations to our responses and our reactions, the same chikrei lev that I recommended at the elementary level. But for the most part, the hashkafa, I believe, is the same. Certainly, one of the scenarios that crops up occasionally is at the entry level of secondary schools. In other words, when kids graduate from elementary and they need to get into schools, so sometimes in some communities it's hard for them to gain acceptance into various schools. So that's an issue that has to be treated much with the same kind of sensitivity as the other issues. But it's only much the same, but not exactly the same. There are all sorts of issues. That's not the topic at hand, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. But I will tell you that Torah U'Mesorah, for example, you asked earlier, what does Torah U'Mesorah really do? So there is one department that we have. It's called Rabbi Yisroel, headed by 3 people, colleagues of mine, whose job it is to make sure the kids are not left without a school. That on occasion that happens too, and it's important to take care of that as well. That's at the entry level. So our conversation here is today based on not entry level, but possibly chas v'shalom exit level. That's our conversation. But I just thought I would throw in the idea of entry level also being an area for concern.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Klein, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Joining us now is Shalva Schneider, who is a clinical social worker in Yerushalayim and is the director of JewEssence, which is a program for Haredi girls who have struggles with themselves and with their Judaism. Mrs. Schneider, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Mrs. Schneider, tell us about how girls find your program and tell us about the program in general and what are the issues that they are grappling with.
Okay, so JewEssence is a program for young adult women ages 18 to about 23, 24 who grew up in Haredi homes in the U.S., Canada, England, who struggle with various different emotional health issues, and they want to grow both in with their emotional health and in terms of their Judaism. They struggle a lot with their Judaism, and they want to reconnect and get healthier and more connected.
Okay, so what specifically are the issues that they're grappling with? Is it emunah issues? Is it?
So I would say that all the girls that come to us are in pain. I would say that that's the number one thing that puts them all together. Some of them, unfortunately are survivors of various types of abuse. Some of them, have some family issues, neglect. Some of them, had severe bullying when they were growing up. Some of them, also suffer from depression and anxiety. I would say that the number one thing that puts them all together is that they feel disconnected from the community. Many of them have a lot of anger and hatred towards people that represent Judaism to them. But the thing is, they get to us. We don't do any advertising because we don't want someone to just send their daughter to us to get her from. We want people that want to grow from themselves. So they mostly get to us from word of mouth. In other words, somebody's friend did JewEssence and they tell their friend, oh, you want to go to this amazing program? Here, you should go to JewEssence. So that's how they normally get to us. And we have 5 areas of growth that we sort of hit on, and that's the Jewish piece, the emotional, cognitive, life skills, and community building.
Mm-hmm. I do want to get back to that point on the anger that they have, but just before that, something came to mind. Do you see differences in their challenges based on their countries of origin, or it's pretty much the same issues that they're dealing with?
So I would say that, we have some that come from more in-town communities. We have girls from, let's say, Lakewood and Brooklyn and Muncie. And then we have some girls that are from more, let's say, out-of-town communities, Baltimore.
Suburbs of New York.
I don't know how to, what we call what. But, in LA and Florida, we also have some girls from England and some from Canada. And I would say, definitely there's this different level of challenge when in the more city oriented communities where things are very, in a certain box, or, like there are certain standards that are very regimented. Yeah. So I think that sometimes those challenges, those girls are coming from more challenging situations than the ones that are in a more out-of-town community where there's a little more room for self-expression and individuality.
So the people who are more from those more insular communities have been more stifled, I guess.
Yeah. That's what I would say.
Interesting.
Obviously, I'm going to disclaimer just from the beginning. This is obviously what I see in my experience, and I don't want to get too specific about students that I have currently or anything like that, just in terms of confidentiality and their privacy. But and I haven't done any statistical analysis or anything like that. This is just based on what I see from where I'm sitting, being involved in JewEssence for the last 5 years.
Right. Okay, 5 years. So the subject of our show specifically is expulsions from school. So I'd like to talk about all of this stuff, but maybe we should reserve it for a show, because it's very important that we hear about this stuff. So what percent of the girls who come to the JewEssence program have been expelled from various schools, high schools, I assume?
Okay, so I think something along the range of 60%, I would say, were asked to leave or expelled from their high schools. We do sometimes get girls that are expelled from their seminaries and then come to us after that. So we have, a certain percentage of that. And then I think that there's another percentage of girls who they were not formally expelled from their schools, but sometimes their schools made it very difficult for them to stay, and it sort of was implied that they should leave.
An effective expulsion.
Yes, exactly. So they weren't actually here's your letter and get out, but it was, made it very difficult for them to stay.
Now, when I think about expulsions, what I'm trying to grapple with and understanding is the impact the expulsion has on the girls. And what's difficult for me to get my head around is that these are girls, boys, it would be the same issue, that are obviously having challenges regardless. So how does the expulsion impact them, and is it possible to kind of do that analysis? Because they were having a tough time anyway. Does the expulsion really matter, or does it throw them off another hoop that they have to go through?
So I think that obviously people get thrown out or expelled for various different reasons, right? So I think that you sometimes have reasons that are, let's say, more severe, right? So that maybe would be in a different category. And then you have people that are expelled. I have a girl that told me that she was once expelled from school for waxing her eyebrows. I had another girl that told me that she was expelled from school for cutting her hair too short. And I think that, when it comes to situations like that, another girl told me that she was caught wearing a tank top under her uniform shirt that was a different color than what she was allowed to be wearing. Those type of things, yes, I definitely think that the girls were probably grappling with something at the time, but I don't think that it was necessarily something so large that would have necessarily warranted them getting expelled from school. Because think about it, take the thread to the end, right? So a girl gets kicked out of school, or anybody, a girl or boy, whatever, gets kicked out of school. So what's that effectively telling them? That's saying, you have no place in our community anymore. Whatever you have done is so severely bad that there's no room for you anymore here. So that 14, 15-year-old kid is supposed to do what now? Where are they supposed to go from there?
It's a total rejection.
A total rejection. And when I speak to my students, the number one thing they say is they're not trying to rebel. Nobody. I was talking to one of my alumni today. She said, nobody at this age wants to rebel. They don't want to leave their communities. They don't want to leave their families. They don't want to leave their friends. They're in pain, and they're telling us something with what they're doing. So yes, maybe it's not right. They're not allowed to wear that certain shirt, or they're not allowed to necessarily cut their hair to that length, and it's against the official school rules. Yes, but I think you need to take a second and think about what is this person saying here. Not just what do we do? It's let's take a little time and like hear them and listen to them and see like what are they trying to get across, and how can we relate to that, and how can we make them, feel a little bit better so that they will thrive.
Right. So when they're showing these external issues, it's representing something internal.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I assume when we hear stories about waxing eyebrows and the hair too short in the tank top, there must have been some history before that going on with the school and the student, and this is maybe It
could be. Sometimes it is. It's a straw that breaks the camel's back, for sure. But again, like I think sometimes some of the girls that will tell me, one of them said to me, like, you have to look at like also what's going on in the girl's home, like what's going on there, like what's leading her to do this. Like they don't want to just be in your face. They don't want to try to get, to be bad, to get, and it's, and I think actually what happens when they come to us, to JewEssence, right? So, how do girls get to us? There's always a long journey, like when I'm finding out, talking to a girl, either in an application process or later on as I'm trying to get to know her, and, how did you get here? And it's like, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. But what happens when they walk into JewEssence, all of a sudden, for the first time in their life, they feel accepted for who they are. And, and they know, like, we're not kicking them out. Like, it doesn't matter. You're like we want to know you, we want to help you, and we have someone that has your back, and then all of a sudden they're able to thrive, because it's not this antagonistic fighting like between them and authority. It's where we got you, we're trying to understand you and like help us to help you.
So we have a girl that went through the school system, was expelled, has this rejection, obviously not good for her self-esteem. How should a parent handle the situation when a child is expelled from school?
So I'm going to say, like, let's go back. I think the piece of the self-esteem is probably the number one piece over here. As I say, like when the girl comes to JewEssence, it's a very long process to get her to a place where, they all come because they want to grow and they want to figure themselves out and they want to reconnect. But that's very difficult to do, right? So you could like really have, the Ratzon, but it's very, it's a very hard process. And the more someone feels rejected and the more somebody's, beaten down, like the harder it is. And that piece of that like self-esteem and self-love is what's going to turn everything around, right? Because if somebody loves themselves, then they're able to grow. But you're not going to grow from a place of self-loathing and just like that there's worthlessness. So if a child is kicked out of school, right, I think that from the parent's perspective, the number one thing that we have to try to preserve is that self-esteem, right? Because that's the piece that's going to be the make it or break it piece over here. So I think just loving them and trying to I guess help them figure out like what their next step's going to be and try to find the next school for them. And I guess sort of like, validate the pain and help them with it and process it. And I understand that, parents are obviously going through their own process of pain as this is happening at the same time, because you have a certain image, I guess, like, of your child and how their life is going to pan out. And all of a sudden it's not like that, so I guess from a parent's perspective, like, that work is their own process of trying to come to that acceptance of like why they're here and how did they get here. But that has to be very separate from being there to be able to support your child through this. And again, like I really think that if you're able to preserve that piece of self-love and self-esteem, you're doing so much for your child.
So I guess that answers my next question to you is how can we help a student recover after being expelled? I guess that answers it between not only the parents but the neighbors and the friends supporting that child, helping support that self-esteem to get through this difficult transition.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if that's the question, is neighbors and friends for sure. Just showing them that you care, showing them that like we're going to help you. You might have gotten expelled from this school, but you're still part of a community. And you're still part of the greater Am Yisrael, like that people care about you.
Now, when a school expels a student, do you find that the schools have tried to assist the student in finding a new home? Are you ever contacted by schools, high schools in the States that are expelling a student saying, we'd like to work with you and transition to the student over to you? Or is it this kid is evicted, thrown out on the street, not actually, and they're on their own trying to find the next step in their life.
So I would probably assume that both happen. Listen, I've never contacted by high school because I just don't work with high school kids. So we're a post-high school program. But I would imagine that there are some high schools that work to help the student find another place. But I think that there are a lot of high schools, from what I hear from my students, that don't do that. One of my girls, one of my students told me today, she was kicked out of school. And then, 2 weeks later, she was walking down the street and she saw the principal of that school who had kicked her out. And she said, "Oh, where are you now? What school are you in?" So she's like, "What are you talking about? You kicked me out of school." So she said, "Well, you didn't go to this other school that's known to take in, girls who have been kicked out." And she's like, it's not so simple. You can't just get into that school in 2 minutes. So, and the girl said to me today, she's like, that was just for her sake. She had to feel better about kicking me out, thinking that I had another place to go, but I didn't have another place to go, and she didn't help me find another place to go. So, I think that sometimes the students feel like, okay, maybe there was a reason that I had to leave the school. Maybe the school couldn't handle me, or maybe there was, a real issue. And I'm not going to say listen, in JewEssence also, there have been times that, we don't kick girls out of school. We do not kick girls out. There have been once or twice in the past where it just wasn't the right fit for us. We weren't the place that could help her where she was right now. And we worked really hard to find where she should go next. And we worked with the families, and we worked to try to help them get there. The girl, they understood that. And those girls not only thanked me for helping get them to the next place, but also have sent me their friends, right? So in other words, they had to leave JewEssence because it wasn't the right fit for them at that point in time, but they still acknowledged the fact that this was a good program that, for their friends, they sent their friends the following year. So, and I think that, if a school was really going through this process that was, for the child, for the good, let's say, of all the children, the students in the school, and obviously with Das Torah and everything like that, even if it came to the result of, okay, for the good of everybody, this is not meeting this girl's needs right now, but then help them find the next place. Don't kick them out onto the street.
Right, absolutely. Now, looking at the issues that the girls in your program are grappling with, would you say that these are the type of issues that when they were in their prior schools, they were negatively impacting others, or these are challenges that they simply had for themselves?
Absolutely not negatively challenging others. Impacting others. I would say that they were mostly for them, things that they were grappling with themselves. And actually, one of the most incredible things that I find in JewEssence is that, we have girls that are, I would say, on all different levels of observance. I have girls that are keeping Shabbat, and some that are not keeping Shabbos. Many are not keeping Shabbos, and there's always a minority that are keeping Shabbos when they come in. But there's no negative peer pressure for the girls that are keeping Shabbos to stop keeping Shabbos, because the girls are so respectful. They want to be respected where they're at, so they're very respectful about where everybody else is at in their process. So we never have this what? Well, you're keeping Shabbos? No, come out with us. You don't have that, because they're so aware of the fact that they want to be respected, and they respect everybody else for their process also at the same time, when it comes from an authentic place. Right. Now I'm surprised that so many girls have been thrown out of school when there were issues that were personal to them, and not that they were negatively impacting the tzibur around them. I mean, I guess you could, I guess that's a question for a high school principal more than for me. But if anything, I've heard stories where friends were told not to be friends with the girls, even at a young age, because they might be a negative influence. I think there's a certain amount of setup that maybe somebody's struggling a little bit, and then when everything else sort of closes in around them, then they're struggling more and more and more and more, and sets them up for failure. Yeah, setting them up for failure. Absolutely. Wow. You mentioned something before about that these girls are upset about authority. Was it something like that they have a different? I think so. Sometimes they struggle with authority, definitely. But again, I think it's as a result of being challenged a lot by authority, and not having respectful interactions with them, I would say. A couple of weeks ago, the creative writing teacher did a prompt with them about bullying, and I just happened to have overheard the class, and some of it was about being bullied by their peers, which is very unfortunate, and obviously like an issue. But some things that came out were being bullied by negative interactions with teachers and with administration, and that. And how that stayed with these girls, like long term, is really quite sad, actually.
Right. I have one more question for you. The challenges that these girls go through, and then they come to a positive program like JewEssence, and Bezras Hashem, their lives get turned around, and they have their self-confidence to get back into the tzibur. Still, what is the impact on them of their past history, for example, on shidduchim and things like that? How does this continue to reverberate, or is it something that you can put behind yourself?
So, Baruch Hashem, we have a couple of our alumni who are married. Did not go through the classical shidduch system. I would definitely say that, in general, the way when a girl is seen for who they are, and people really take time to get to know them and understand them and help them from a very authentic, real place, then get them the help that they need. Like, listen, some of them are, have a history of trauma, and some of them have real issues that they have to work out. But if they're feel that they're surrounded by love and by people that really have their back and are helping them, then they like blossom and they flourish. And I had a girl that messaged the group chat the other day. First of all, we have these, the WhatsApp group chats, and they're always giving each other chizuk, it's so beautiful to see. I'll wake up in the morning and there'll be 85 messages on the chat, and they're, one's going through a tough time and the rest of them are there for her, which is really beautiful. And, one of the girls, she's texting, she bought some stuff in the shuk and she didn't know if she has to take Truma Meiser off of it, and how does she take Truma Meiser, and she ends up calling my husband to ask him, and and this whole thing, and this girl walked in a year and a half ago not keeping Shabbos. It's unbelievable to see, when they start sprouting, they just grow. It's Tu B'Shvat right now as we're recording it, they just grow. The other thing that I just want to point out, sorry if I'm going to take over your question for a minute, is I think that when it comes from, I think about this every time I'm in shul, which is not very often, when we put away the Sefer Torah and we sing, we say Derechecha Derechei Noam, right? So it always hits me, Torah is supposed to be pleasant. It's supposed to be sweet. And if for whatever reason our young people are not feeling the sweetness and the pleasantness of Torah, the issue is not with Torah. The issue is with us and how we're transmitting it. So, and because the issue is also not with them. So we, I think, as educators, as the adults in the community, I think we need to figure out how to transmit this in a way that they can receive it, because the whole goal of chinuch is to be able to give it over to them. And if for whatever reason, I don't know if it's a generational thing or it's whatever it is, community thing, if for whatever reason our young people are not receiving the education and the Torah in the way that it's supposed to, and the Masorah that is in the way that we're trying to give it over, then I think we need to take stock and figure out how are we going to give it over that it's going to be received by them.
Chanoch lena'ar or na'ara al pi darka.
100%. But I think what happens is that sometimes in the community, for whatever reason, we're closing ranks, and we're stifling these girls so much by what we're saying is Torah, and it's really not Torah, and it's not halacha, and they're not feeling the pleasantness. They're just feeling the hardship, and they don't want to be part of something that's just hard. It's just not what they want. But if we could show them the beauty, and we could show them connection, we could show them relationships, and we could show them all these wonderful things, then they want to be a part of it.
Very nice. Mrs. Schneider, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So much. Thank you. Joining us now is Jonathan Rosenblum. We're actually sitting together here in Yerushalayim. Jonathan, as is known, is the famed author, writer, writes for Mishpacha Magazine. He has authored numerous biographies of Gedolei Yisrael. We are chavrusas together, and I mentioned to Jonathan that we were having a headline show on expelling from school, and he mentioned that he had a story that I asked him to record it as he was about to tell me. I said, stop, I'd like to record this so we can include it in the show. So here you go, Jonathan.
I think this story appears in Rav Shlomo Lawrence's book, B'Mechitzatam, or In Their Shadows, in English. It concerns Rav Shach. It's a story. Rav Shach was very old, basically remained in bed most of the day, I think he was probably already in his hundreds or late 90s. And two Menalim of yeshivas, there was a certain bacher they wanted to throw out. He had obviously done something pretty bad. I think maybe he had been Mechal Shabbos. That's not clear in the story, or I don't know that part of the story. But they felt that before they expelled a bacher from the yeshiva, they should talk it over with Rav Shach. They expected they would get a haskama, especially when they shared with Rav Shach the severity of what this bacher had done. They went, Rav Shach was lying in his bed, and they explained that they were planning to throw a bacher out of the yeshiva and said what he had done. At that point, Rav Shach asked them a question. He asked them, what's his home situation? What's going on in the house? So they responded that they didn't know. It never occurred to them that was pertinent to the issue of whether to expel this bacher or not. And Rav Shach, sort of like Yaakov Avinu on his mitah, lifted himself up to a sitting position and started shouting at them, Rotzchim, Rotzchim, you're murderers. How do you come to throw a boy out of yeshiva if you don't know his circumstances, if you don't know what's going on in his family, if you have no idea what's going on with him? Did you ever talk to him? What do you know? How can you possibly think to do such a thing? And subsequently they went and checked, and they found out that the week in which this particular incident had taken place, that his father had given his mother a get. So there really was something in the familial situation which could largely explain what was going on with him. But the fact that Rav Shach just thought that you cannot, if you haven't delved into every aspect of the situation, you can't throw a boy out of a yeshiva without first having found out what his situation is. It just struck me. And this is Rav Shach at his, at a very elderly age, but still the pikus, and the concern for every member of Klal Yisrael just stands out. It's a story that doesn't leave you easily.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us.